What secrets are hidden within the structural density of medieval sapitariums? These unyielding layers of cold stone were engineered to isolate madness from the waking world, creating a silent fortress of thermal inertia. Tonight, we examine the engineering of isolation, drifting off to the steady, repetitive history of ancient architectural silence. Welcome back, traveler, to Boring History, a quiet corner of the world where we leave behind the noise of today and gently wander into the stillness of the past. Here, the fires of history burn low and steady, casting long shadows over forgotten stories. We are not here for kings and conquests, but for the quiet, strange, and sometimes unsettling moments that time nearly buried. Before you get comfy, go ahead and like the video and subscribe, only if you're actually enjoying it. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. I'm always curious to see the mix of places and time zones hanging out here together. Segment 1. The world before the walls expanded. The year is 1247. Dawn has not yet fully broken over the city of London, and already the Thames is alive. Flat-bottomed boats, loaded with wool bales and salt fish, push against the current, their oarsmen grunting rhythmically, breath misting in the cold air. On the south bank, tanneries are beginning their day's work, the reek of urine and oak bark rising from great stone vats, drifting northward across the water in a slow chemical fog that the city's residents have long since stopped noticing. The bridge, stone and crowded with timber houses jutting out over the water like teeth grown crooked, carries a thin trickle of early traffic. A monk with a donkey, 2 women carrying baskets, a boy running for reasons that only boys running at dawn fully understand. The bells of a dozen churches are just beginning their conversation, St. Paul's deep and authoritative, the smaller parish churches answering in lighter voices, the whole city calibrating itself to the sound of iron and faith. This is a city of perhaps 80,000 souls. It is, by the standards of 13th century Europe, enormous. It is also, by any standard of any century, extraordinarily loud, extraordinarily smelly, extraordinarily alive, with the friction of human bodies pressing against one another in narrow lanes that were never designed to carry this much life. There is no zoning. There is no planning in the modern sense. The butcher's shop sits beside the apothecary, which sits beside the rope maker, which opens directly onto a lane where children play and pigs forage, and a man is conducting an argument with considerable passion about the price of a cartload of hay. The city is a single organism with 80,000 nervous systems, all of them firing at once, and somewhere in the narrow lanes near Bishopsgate, there is a sound that does not belong to commerce or prayer or the cheerful brutality of daily medieval life. It is a cry, long and hollow, without the sharp edges of anger or the clear trajectory of grief. It rises from behind a timber gate and hangs in the cold air for a moment before the city absorbs it, before the bells and the cartwheels and the argument about hay cover it over, before the ordinary noise of the world swallows it, as the world has always swallowed sounds it does not wish to hear. This is Bethlem, the priory of St. Mary of Bethlehem, founded just 6 years earlier, in 1247, by Simon Fitzmary, a sheriff of London, with deep pockets and apparently deep piety. It sits on a plot of ground just outside the city walls, close enough to be convenient, far enough to be, in the most polite architectural way possible, elsewhere. At this moment in its life, it is still primarily a priory, a house of religious life, a place where canons live and pray and perform the charitable functions that medieval Christianity assigns to institutions of its kind. It receives travelers, it cares for the sick, it operates within the broad, generous, somewhat vague mandate that medieval charitable foundations always carried, to do good, in God's name, for those whom the world has not treated well. It will not be recorded as specifically housing the mentally ill until 1403, when an official survey will note the presence of 6 insane patients and the chains they are kept in. But the sounds suggest an earlier beginning. The sounds suggest that the city, in its pragmatic medieval way, has already begun sending its most bewildering cases to the place outside the walls that has, perhaps by default, perhaps by gradual and unrecorded negotiation, become the place where such people go. But before we understand why those walls were eventually built thick, before we follow the stone to its full terrible logic, we must go further back. We must go to the world before walls, the world before institutions, the world in which the person whose mind had broken, the one weeping without cause, the one raving in the streets, the one convinced of voices no one else could hear, had nowhere to go at all, except wherever the world's indifference carried them. For most of recorded human history, mental illness was managed, if that word can be stretched to cover what actually happened, within the family. This was not a policy. It was not a philosophy. It was simply what you did with a problem that had no other solution. A woman who began to hear voices in her 30s, who stopped sleeping, who walked the perimeter of her house all night long, muttering prayers against enemies only she could see. She was managed by her husband, her children, her neighbors, within the close mesh of village or urban community that constituted the entire social safety net of the medieval world. There were no alternatives. The alternative was the road, and the road was not metaphor. When families could no longer cope, when the violent became too violent, when the wandering became too dangerous, when the strangeness became too shameful or the care too exhausting for people who were themselves one bad harvest away from catastrophe, the person was turned out, into the road, literally. They walked, they begged, they ate from middens and slept in ditches and moved from village to village, each village tolerating them for as long as charity or curiosity held out before moving them along by means ranging from the gentle to the brutal. They washed up in cities, which had a slightly greater tolerance for human strangeness simply by virtue of having more of it. They crouched under bridges. They slept in churchyards, which had a certain protected status even the desperate could exploit. The Church, to its credit, did not entirely look away. The Christian theological framework was, in its complex way, somewhat more accommodating of madness than the social world it sat within. Christ had healed the possessed. The apostles had cast out demons. The mad person was not simply a failed human being, but a site of spiritual contest, a soul in particular need of divine attention, a case that belonged, in some sense, to God. This meant that churches, and particularly the larger monastic establishments and cathedral foundations, were places where the mentally ill might find at least temporary shelter, at least a bowl of soup, at least the bowl of soup, at least the dignity of being prayed over rather than simply driven away. Pilgrimage shrines associated with healing attracted the mentally ill in large numbers. The shrine of Saint Dymphna at Geel, in what is now Belgium, was particularly associated with the insane. Dymphna, being a legendary Irish princess whose story involved madness and martyrdom and whose bones were credited with miraculous cures, pilgrims traveled to Geel from across northern Europe, some of them bringing family members in states that we would now recognize as severe psychosis, profound depression, or intellectual disability. The local community at Geel, over centuries, developed an informal system of boarding these pilgrims in family homes, one of the earliest examples of community mental health care in European history, and one that, remarkably, persisted into the 20th century. But Geel was exceptional. It was a community that had, by accident and tradition, developed a tolerance and a practice. Most of Europe had nothing comparable. Most of Europe had the road. The violence visited upon those who wandered that road is documented in fragments in court records, in chronicle asides, in the occasional pastoral letter from a bishop disturbed by what he had observed. Wandering individuals described as mad were beaten by villagers who feared them. They were robbed by those who considered them fair targets. They were sexually assaulted with a frequency that the historical record obscures but does not entirely hide. They were put to labor by anyone strong enough to compel it, worked until they broke further, then abandoned. They were imprisoned in jails, not for crimes but simply because no other container presented itself. And in those jails they mixed with criminals and debtors in conditions so brutal that the distinction between incarceration and death was often a matter of weeks. Children described as idiots or lunatics were particular victims. Families sometimes abandoned them in cities, hoping someone else would take responsibility. Some were taken into households as servants, their cognitive or emotional difficulties ignored as long as they could perform basic functions, their vulnerability to exploitation considered unremarkable. Some were simply left to die, in the casual way that a world with very thin margins deals with problems it cannot afford to solve. The theological position on all of this was complicated. On one hand, the mad were deserving of Christian charity. The soul within was as valuable as any other, more valuable perhaps, given its suffering. On the other hand, madness was interpreted through a framework that made it deeply ambiguous. Was the raving man possessed by a demon? Was the melancholic woman under God's punishment for sin? Was the person who heard voices perhaps genuinely hearing something supernatural, and if so, was it holy or diabolical? The Church's approach to mental illness was never single or systematic. It ranged from genuine pastoral care to outright persecution, and an individual's experience could depend entirely on which priest, which bishop, which local tradition they encountered. The witch trials, which would reach their terrible peak in the 15th and 16th centuries, but had deep medieval roots, consumed an unknowable number of people whose primary offense was mental illness that their communities interpreted as supernatural malevolence. The woman who muttered to herself, who had sudden episodes of bizarre behavior, who claimed to see things others could not see, she was not necessarily read as sick. She was read as dangerous, as in league with forces that threatened the community's spiritual safety. The response to that reading was not care, it was fire. So the world before the walls was not gentle. It was not a pastoral time when the mad roamed free in harmony with a tolerant community. It was a world in which people whose minds had broken faced a stark and brutal set of possible futures. Care by family until the family broke, charity from the church until the church's patience ran out. The road, the jail, violence, early death, or rarely, for the very lucky, a community like Geel that had learned, by long practice, to live alongside what it did not fully understand. It is into this world that the first asylum walls were introduced, not as a solution. No one in 1247 was thinking in terms of solutions, not as a system. The institutional framework of mental health care was centuries from existing, but as a response, a physical, material response to the question of what you do with the person who cannot manage in the ordinary world, and for whom the ordinary world has no place. The response was stone. Heavy, cold, permanent stone. Walls 3 and 4 feet thick, gates of oak reinforced with iron, windows cut narrow and high, so that light entered but the world did not. The priory at Bethlem was not built as an asylum, but the logic that would make it one was already present in its architecture, in the decision to build outside the city walls, in the decision to build in stone, in the decision to build, fundamentally, a container. The mason who cut those first stones almost certainly gave no thought to the people who would one day live behind them. He was thinking about load-bearing capacity, about the quality of the local limestone, about the wages his crew expected by Friday. But in cutting those stones and setting them in mortar, he was participating in one of history's quiet pivots, the moment when a society decides that a problem which has always been dispersed, always been individual, always been someone else's private tragedy, will now be gathered together, named, housed, made institutional. The sound that rises from behind the timber gate at Bethlem on that cold morning in 1247 is the sound of that pivot happening in real time. It is the sound of the world before the walls beginning, slowly and without ceremony, to become the world with them. And once walls exist, they grow thicker. That is the nature of walls. That is the nature of the problems they are built to contain. The stones are only the beginning. Segment 2. The architects of isolation expanded. Brother Thomas had never studied medicine. This should be understood clearly at the outset, because it explains almost everything about what he built and why he built it the way he did. He had never read Galen's treatises on the brain, never worked through the Arabic medical commentaries that were in the universities of his day, slowly trickling into Latin translation and reshaping what educated physicians thought they knew about the body and its failures. He could not have told you the difference between a melancholic and a phrenetic, could not have explained the theory of animal spirits or the role of the ventricles of the brain in the production of thought and feeling. What he knew was the rule of his order, the cycle of the divine office, the management of a friary's grain stores, the spiritual weight of a good confessor, and the particular, exhausting madness that visited the friary each winter when a lay brother named Edmund began screaming in the night. Edmund's episodes had been going on for 3 years. They began in November, reliably, as if the shortening of the days were a key turning in a lock that lived somewhere behind his eyes. He would grow quiet first, not the good quiet of contemplation, but a bad quiet, the quiet of something gathering itself. Then, over a week or 10 days, the quiet would tip into something else. He would stop sleeping. He would begin to mutter during the divine office, not prayers but fragments, accusations, warnings about enemies no one else could see. His face would take on the bright, fixed expression that Brother Thomas had learned to dread. Not anger exactly, not fear exactly, but a terrible alertness, as if Edmund were watching something happening just beyond the visible world, something urgent and ongoing and catastrophic that only he could see. And then the screaming would start, and it would not stop until spring. The other brothers managed as best they could. They prayed with Edmund, and they prayed about him, and they tried the remedies available to them. Cold water applied to the head. Periods of fasting on the theory that full humors made the episodes worse. the recitation of certain psalms believed to have efficacy against demonic influence, the application of a poultice recommended by a traveling physician who had read about it somewhere and was not entirely sure it worked. None of it made any appreciable difference. What made a difference was spring. Every April, with the lengthening of the days, Edmund returned to himself. He would be thin and exhausted and quietly mortified by whatever he dimly remembered of his winter self. But he would be Edmund again, gentle, hard-working, reliable with the cows. It was after the third winter that Brother Thomas made his suggestion, not to punish Edmund, not because he had given up on him, or ceased to regard him as a brother deserving of full Christian consideration, but because 3 winters of screaming had begun to leave marks on the entire community. The novices were frightened. 2 of the older brothers had developed a chronic sleeplessness that the infirmary was struggling to treat. The prayers of the divine office were being disrupted in ways that the prior considered a spiritual emergency alongside the practical one. And there was a harder truth underneath all of this, which Brother Thomas was honest enough to name. When Edmund screamed, it was very difficult to believe that God was present in the room. Not because God was absent, Brother Thomas was clear on this point, theologically, but because something in the human brain, even a well-trained monastic brain, could not maintain the posture of prayer while another human being was in that kind of distress. The separate room was the solution that presented itself. Not a dungeon, not a punishment cell, a room at the end of the north corridor where the walls were thickest, where the door was solid, where the window looked out on the kitchen garden rather than the main courtyard, a room where Edmund could be during his episodes, where his suffering would not multiply into everyone else's suffering, where the community could maintain its rhythm while he moved through whatever moved through him. Brother Thomas's reasoning was pastoral. It was also, without his knowing it, architectural. In deciding that a solid wall between Edmund and the rest of the community was the most workable solution, he was articulating a principle that would define institutional mental health care for the next 800 years, the principle of separation, and with it, the principle that the quality of the separation mattered enormously. A thin wall was no wall. Sound passed through it, presence passed through it. The disturbance traveled through plaster and timber as if they weren't there. A thick wall was something else. A thick wall was an argument. It said, on this side, one reality, on that side, another. The wall does not judge either reality. It simply insists that they are not the same reality, and that they require different conditions. Brother Thomas was not unique. Across 13th century Europe, in monasteries and hospitals and cathedral foundations, similar decisions were being made by similar men, practical men, not theorists, men whose primary qualifications were experience and necessity. The great advantage of the monastic tradition as the incubator for institutional care was precisely that monks understood, from their own architecture, the power of physical enclosure. The monastery itself was an institution built on the principle that a wall between the sacred and the secular made both possible. The cloister was not a prison, it was a preservation. The wall around the monastic precinct was not a statement of contempt for the world outside, but a statement that different forms of life required different forms of space. When this architectural logic was applied to the care of the mentally ill, the results were, inevitably, a distortion of the original principle. The monk chose his enclosure. The monk's enclosure was oriented toward God and the growth of the soul, and every feature of its architecture, the garden, the library, the chapter house, the church, was designed to support that orientation. The patient's enclosure was chosen for the patient, and its architecture was oriented primarily toward management, the management of behavior, the management of risk, the management of the community's peace. These are not the same thing, and confusing them would cause centuries of harm. But at the moment of origin, in the rooms where Brother Thomas made his practical decision, where a prior in Valencia ordered a separate ward built for patients who could not be housed with the physically ill, where the bishops and city councils of northern European cities began to formalize what had been informal, the architectural logic felt coherent and even merciful. The choice was not walls or freedom. The choice was walls or the road. And the road, as everyone knew, was worse. The men who designed these first asylums, if design is even the right word for decisions made incrementally, pragmatically, without overall plan, drew on the 2 architectural traditions most available to them, the monastery and the prison. Both were institutions defined by enclosure. Both used thick stone walls as their primary structural and symbolic statement. Both understood that the quality of the wall, its thickness, its permanence, its impermeability to sound and sight and weather, was integral to the institution's function. The monasteries' walls kept the sacred in and the secular out. The prison's walls kept the criminal in and the public out. The asylum's walls would keep the disturbed in and the disturbing out, simultaneously in both directions, serving the inmate and the community in the same gesture. This borrowing from existing architectural languages was not cynical. It was practical, and it was also, in a sense, inevitable. When you need to build something new and you have no template for it, you reach for the templates you have. The builders of early asylums were not trying to build prisons. They were not, in their own understanding, trying to build places of punishment. They were trying to build places of containment that would be, by the standards of their world, an improvement on the alternative. They reached for stone because stone was what serious, permanent, trustworthy structures were made from. They reached for thick walls because thick walls were what serious, permanent, trustworthy enclosures required. The institutions that emerged from these decisions were shaped by their builders' deepest assumptions in ways those builders could not fully see. If you believe, as the medieval world broadly believed, that madness is a force, a spiritual disturbance, a humoral crisis, an assault on the rational soul by supernatural or physical agents, then your institution will be designed to contain that force. The walls will be sized to match the enemy. And because the enemy is invisible, unpredictable, and associated in popular imagination with tremendous destructive power, the frenzied man tearing off his chains, the woman screaming prophecy, the possessed child throwing himself against the wall, the walls will be built, every time, slightly thicker than strictly necessary. Safety margins in architecture always reflect the fear of the builder. The safety margins in asylum walls reflected a very specific medieval fear, that madness, once housed, might find a way through anything less than stone. The architects of isolation were not monsters. They were not indifferent to the suffering of the people whose lives would be bounded by their decisions. They were men working within a framework of knowledge and belief that we can judge from the outside but cannot fully inhabit from within. They knew what they knew, which was limited. They built what they could, which was impressive. And they created, in those first thick walls, an institution that would shape the experience of mental illness for centuries. An institution that carried within its stones both the first impulse toward care and the first impulse toward control, and never resolved the tension between them. Brother Thomas's separate room at the end of the North Corridor was not the end of anything. It was the beginning of a very long story about what happens when you decide that suffering requires walls, and what happens next, and what happens after that, and how long it takes a civilization to ask whether the walls are, in fact, working. The answer to that question would take 800 years to arrive. The stones were still being cut. Segment 3, what the walls were made to hold, expanded. To understand why the walls were thick, you must first sit inside the theory. You must enter the epistemological building, which is itself a kind of structure, with its own walls, its own load-bearing assumptions, its own sealed rooms where light enters only through narrow windows cut at specific angles by specific hands. And you must try to see the world the way a medieval physician saw it, not as an exercise in condescension, not to marvel at ignorance from a comfortable distance, but because the walls were built to contain something that the people building them genuinely believed was there. And if you want to understand the walls, you must first understand the thing they were designed to hold. The theory was moral, it was ancient, having originated with Hippocrates and been systematized by Galen in the 2nd century AD. But by the time it reached the medical minds of 13th century Europe, it had traveled through 8 centuries of transmission, through Byzantine compilers, through Arabic translators and commentators of breathtaking sophistication, through the great synthesis projects of scholars like Avicenna, whose canon of medicine sat on every serious medical faculty's reading list, and finally through the Latin translations produced at Toledo and Salerno, that brought this vast accumulated medical tradition into the hands of European physicians who read it with a mixture of reverence and selective interpretation. What emerged from this long game of intellectual telephone was a theory of the human body and its disorders that had genuine coherence, genuine explanatory power within its own frame, and a deeply structural relationship to the architecture it would eventually produce. The body, in this framework, was governed by 4 humors: blood, which was warm and moist, and associated with air and with the sanguine temperament; phlegm, which was cold and moist, and associated with water; yellow bile, which was warm and dry, and associated with fire; and black bile, which was cold and dry and associated with earth. Health was the proper balance of these four substances. Disease was their imbalance, too much of one, too little of another, or a corruption of quality in any of them. Mental illness lived within this framework as a particular category of humoral disorder, specifically one involving the brain and the pneuma, the vital spirit, a kind of refined physiological breath that carried sensation and thought through the body's systems. The brain was where the rational soul did its work, and the brain was profoundly vulnerable to humoral influence. Too much blood rushing to the brain produced mania, the elevated racing grandiose state that medieval physicians called phrenitis, or mania, characterized by agitation, sleeplessness, rapid speech, delusions of power. Too much yellow bile, hot and sharp and corrosive, produced a similar frenzy, but with more violent burning qualities. The furiosi, the raving madman who tore at his clothes and his chains, and seemed almost literally to be burning from within. And too much black bile, cold, dark, earthly, slow, produced melancholia, the terrible inward collapse, the certainty of damnation, the withdrawal from all pleasure and meaning, the conviction that the world was without hope, and the self without worth. Black bile was, in many ways, the most philosophically interesting of the four humors, and also the most terrifying. It was associated with the earth, which meant it was heavy, which meant it sank. It gathered in the lower organs, particularly the spleen, and from there it rose, paradoxically, as a vapor. The theory held that black bile could vaporize under certain conditions: heat, stress, the influence of the planet Saturn, which was astrologically connected to black bile and melancholy, and when it vaporized, the vapor rose to the brain. There it chilled the vital spirits, darkened the pneuma, and produced the characteristic symptoms of melancholic madness: the heaviness, the coldness, the darkness that patients described as if they were drowning in something thick and slow and absolutely without light. Medieval physicians debated the specifics with genuine sophistication. Was the melancholia caused by the vapor of the black bile itself, or by the cold and dry quality it imparted to the brain's pneuma? Was the famous association between melancholia and intellectual genius a connection traced back to Aristotle's Problems, which asked why so many great men were melancholic, evidence that the condition was complex rather than simply pathological? Could a person have too much black bile and be thereby constitutionally inclined to both madness and wisdom? These were real questions, debated in real classrooms, answered with real arguments that drew on genuine observation of patients alongside inherited theory. But for the purposes of understanding the walls, what matters most is not the sophistication of the debate, but the physical model of disease that underlay it. The humors were substances. They were real, material things, literally present in the body as fluids, literally visible in blood and phlegm and bile. When they went wrong in physical, material ways. They accumulated, they corrupted, they moved to places they shouldn't be, they transformed into vapors and gases that traveled through the body's passages. The treatments that followed from this model were physical and material: bleeding to reduce excess blood, purging to expel corrupted humors, dietary changes to alter the humoral balance, cold baths to cool excessive heat, warm baths to address excessive cold, and crucially for our purposes, the environmental management of air and atmosphere, because the humors were understood to be sensitive to and interactive with the ambient environment, particularly the quality of the air. Bad air made bad humors worse. This was not metaphor. The theory of miasma, the idea that corrupted air, particularly the air around swamps, middens, and unburied dead, was itself a vector of disease, was deeply connected to humoral theory. If you already had an excess of black bile and you breathed cold, damp, stagnant air, the cold and damp of the air would worsen the cold and damp of your bile. If you were already prone to frenzy and you were exposed to excessive heat, summer air, the air of a crowd, the charged air of violent emotion, your yellow bile would be further agitated. The walls, in this context, were not merely containers for people, they were containers for atmosphere. The thick stone walls of an asylum created a sealed environment, or as close to sealed as pre-modern architecture could manage, in which the air could be, theoretically, controlled. Cold drafts could be excluded. Excessive heat could be moderated by the thermal mass of the stone. The airs of the city outside, its smells, its fogs, its miasmatic emanations from the river and the markets and the tanneries, could be kept from mingling too freely with the air of the asylum interior. Whether this actually helped patients in the way medieval physicians theorized is a different question, but the theoretical logic was sound within its own terms. If madness was a condition of substances that were sensitive to environment, then managing the environment was a form of treatment. The contagion theory added another layer to the wall's necessity. Madness, in the medieval understanding, could spread not in the modern sense of bacterial or viral infection, but in the sense of atmospheric and spiritual influence. The humors of one person could affect the humors of another through shared air, through the vibrations of sound, particularly the sound of raving, which was understood as a kind of humoral emission, through the influence of strong emotion on observers. A community exposed to a raving patient over time would find its own humoral balance disturbed. The frenzy would, in some sense, be contagious, not to everyone, not deterministically, but as a risk, a vulnerability, something that could tip those already inclined toward imbalance further out of it. This is why the screaming mattered architecturally. The sound of the raving patient was not merely a social nuisance, not merely distressing to hear. It was a potential medical vector. Sound was the primary medium through which the agitated humors of one person could reach and disturb the humors of another. Thick walls stopped sound. Thick walls, therefore, prevented the contagion of madness. The asylum's walls protected the patients within from the humoral disturbances of the city, and they protected the city from the humoral disturbances of the patients. The wall was prophylactic in both directions. To call this wrong is easy. To see what made it convincing is harder and more important. Medieval physicians were not imagining this framework from nothing. They were working from real observations, that patients who were isolated from sources of stress and stimulation sometimes stabilized, that communities exposed to mass panic or collective grief did seem to experience cascading emotional disturbance, that environment and mood were deeply connected, that people in the grip of extreme emotional states had a genuine capacity to affect the emotional states of those around them. The humoral theory gave a mechanistic account of these real phenomena that was wrong in its specifics but not wrong in its general intuition, and the walls that this theory produced, thick stone, sealed, isolating, captured something true even while they captured it within a wrong framework. The removal of a severely mentally ill person from a chaotic, demanding, violent, unpredictable urban environment into a space that was stable, quiet, and structured did help some of them. Not because it balanced their humors in the way medieval physicians thought, but because human beings in genuine psychological crisis often need, above everything else, the removal of further demand. They need stillness. They need an environment that does not require constant navigation, constant response, constant survival management. The thick walls provided that, clumsily and imperfectly, and at enormous human cost, but genuinely. The walls were built to hold something medieval people called black bile and yellow bile and humoral imbalance. What they actually held, some of the time, was something real, the chaos of an uncontrolled world pressing too hard against a mind that had lost its ability to press back. The walls were wrong about what they were containing. They were not entirely wrong that something needed containing. Segment 4. The sound problem. There is a fact that sits at the center of asylum history that tends to get left out of the theoretical accounts, the medical histories, the architectural analyses, and the philosophical retrospectives, perhaps because it is too simple, too physical, too embarrassingly basic for a history that wants to deal in ideas and systems and the long arc of social policy. The fact is this: the places where mentally ill people were gathered together were, in their acute phases, extraordinarily loud. They were loud in a way that was physically taxing to be near. They were loud in a way that made sustained thought impossible, that disrupted sleep completely, that wore down the people within them and around them through sheer acoustic force over days and weeks and months, without relief. This is not metaphor. It is not a poetic way of describing the weight of suffering or the clamor of desperate minds. It is a literal description of a physical environment in which human beings in states of extreme psychological distress were generating noise, sustained, relentless, high-volume noise, and that noise had to go somewhere. And the question of where it went was not a minor logistical matter, but one of the central engineering problems of institutional mental health care for approximately 8 centuries. Consider what happens inside a human body in the grip of acute psychosis. The nervous system is not in a state of ordinary arousal. It is operating at registers that ordinary life almost never demands the full activation of fight or flight responses, running on a loop without the stimulus that would normally trigger them, without the resolution that would normally end them. The person feels, with absolute physiological conviction, that they are in danger, even if they are sitting in a room with no evident threat, even if the danger is located in dimensions of reality that no one else can access. That physiological conviction produces a physiological response: elevated heart rate, elevated respiration, muscle tension, heightened sensory processing, and most relevantly for our purposes, the vocalization that the human body uses to signal distress, to call for help, to attempt to manage terror through sound. The screaming of a person in acute psychosis is not like other screaming. It does not have the brief, sharp quality of a scream in response to sudden fright. It does not have the building and releasing quality of grief. It is, at its worst, continuous or near continuous, cycling without clear resolution through registers of terror and rage, and something that sounds almost like ecstasy, but is nothing like it. The vocalization of a nervous system that has lost its anchor and cannot find its way back to silence. Alongside this, the rhythmic sounds of repetitive movement, bodies rocking against walls and floors, the percussion of pacing in small spaces, the particular acoustic signature of someone muttering rapidly under their breath for hours on end. And then there is weeping, not the weeping of ordinary sadness, but the weeping of absolute despair, the kind that comes from a place so deep in the body that it seems to have no beginning and no end. The kind that makes observers feel that something fundamental about the human condition is being expressed, and there is nothing adequate to say in response. Now gather 12 people in this state, or 20, or 30, into a single building. Give them shared corridors and shared sleeping spaces. Allow the acute episodes of some to trigger the arousal of others. As they will, because human beings are profoundly responsive to the distress vocalizations of other human beings. And even a person whose own distress has temporarily quieted will find it reignited by exposure to another's screaming. This is not weakness, it is neurology. It is the hardwired response of a social species to signals of distress in its vicinity. In ordinary life, this responsiveness serves us. It makes us go to the aid of others, makes us take collective threats seriously, keeps us connected to each other's suffering. In an asylum with 30 acute patients and walls made of timber and plaster, this responsiveness becomes a catastrophe of mutual amplification. The medieval builders understood this not in neurological terms. They didn't have neurological terms, but in the direct experiential terms of people who had tried to manage these environments and found them unmanageable. They understood it the way you understand a problem when you have to live inside it for years. They understood that sound was the central management problem, and that the management of sound required walls of a particular kind. Wood, the primary building material of the medieval period, is acoustically a disastrous choice for institutions housing people in states of acute distress. Timber-framed buildings transmit sound with remarkable fidelity. The structure itself becomes a resonant body, carrying vibrations from room to room, from floor to floor, through the very skeleton of the building. Plaster and wattle fill between the timbers offers modest attenuation, but nothing remotely adequate to the task. A person screaming in a timber-framed building is essentially screaming in the same acoustic space as everyone else in that building, with only the nominal privacy of walls that absorb almost nothing. Stone is categorically different. A wall of solid stone 3 feet thick does not resonate. It absorbs. It converts the acoustic energy of sound into a minute amount of heat, dissipated through the thermal mass of the material. It does not carry the vibration forward. It stops it. The reduction in sound transmission through a solid stone wall compared to a timber-framed partition is not incremental, it is transformative. What was a scream becomes, on the other side of a proper stone wall, something between a murmur and silence. The world is remade. The acoustic catastrophe of 20 acute patients in a timber building becomes, in a stone building of comparable size, something that can be managed, that can be navigated, that allows the keeper at the far end of the corridor to sit with a patient in something approaching calm, even while another patient, 3 rooms away and 2 feet of stone distant, is in full crisis. This is why the walls were thick, and it is a reason that is almost never stated in the historical record, because the historical record is written by people who are thinking about theology and medical theory and social policy rather than about the basic acoustic physics of large buildings. But the people who built these institutions were not writing histories, they were solving problems, and the problem of sound was as immediate and unavoidable and central as any abstract consideration of humoral theory or Christian charity. You could not run an institution in a building that was acoustically transparent to its own crises. You could not maintain any form of care, however imperfect, however mixed in its motives, in an environment where everyone within it was being continuously exposed to everyone else's worst moments. The thick walls, in this sense, were therapeutic infrastructure for the institution as a whole, not just for individual patients. They made it possible for the building to function. They made it possible for keepers to develop relationships with some patients while managing others. They made it possible for there to be quiet corners, stable rooms, places where a patient in a coma phase could be housed without constant re-traumatization by exposure to the acute phases of their neighbors. They created the possibility, however rarely realized, of differential care, the recognition that different patients at different points in their illness needed different environments, and that an institution could only provide different environments if it had, in its very bones, the acoustic separation to make difference possible. But there is a darker acoustic history here as well, and it would be dishonest to tell the sound story without it. The theatrical use of the asylum, its transformation, particularly from the 16th century onward, from a place of uncertain care into a site of entertainment, was made possible, in large part, by the same acoustic architecture that made the institution manageable. The thick walls of Bethlem, which had developed by the 16th century into a large, established institution with dozens of patients and a public reputation, created a contained acoustic environment that could be entered and exited by visitors who wished to observe the spectacle of madness from a position of safety. The galleries through which paying visitors walked on their Sunday afternoons were acoustically buffered from the worst of the wards. The screaming was present but managed, present but framed, present in exactly the amount that made the experience vivid without making it unbearable, which is to say, in exactly the amount that a good theatrical production calibrates its drama. The institution became, in this period, a show, and the thick walls were the stage design. Visitors came to see what they came to see, proof that their own minds were intact, confirmation of the distance between themselves and the terrifying alterity of madness, the particular satisfaction of being frightened by something from which they were by virtue of the walls and their own sanity and their ability to leave when they chose, entirely protected. The thick walls made this experience possible. They created the frame. They established the boundary between observer and observed, between the normal and the pathological, between the city and its shadow. This is the ambiguity that the sound story forces into view. The same walls that protected patients from each other's crises also turned those crises into spectacle. The same stone that absorbed the worst of the screaming also amplified its theatrical quality by containing it, by giving it a stage, by ensuring that it was always heard at a remove, never so loud that it was simply unbearable, always loud enough to remind you that something extraordinary and awful was happening just beyond the frame. The medieval builders could not have anticipated this. They were solving practical problems with practical materials, but in solving the sound problem, they created an acoustic architecture that carried within it the seeds of something they did not intend and would not have endorsed: the commodification of suffering, the conversion of crisis into entertainment, the institution as theater. The walls stopped the sound from escaping. That was the intention. What they did not stop was the gaze from entering. And the gaze, over the centuries, would prove in its own way as destructive as any noise. Segment 5. The cold logic of care expanded. In the winter of 1321, the keeper of Bethlem recorded in the priory accounts only as Peter, sometimes called Peter the Porter, which may have been his name or may have been a description of his primary function, submitted a quarterly accounting to the priory administration. It is one of the earliest detailed records of the institution's daily operations, and it repays close reading, not for what it says, but for the shape of what it doesn't say, for the absences that outline a reality as clearly as any direct description. The accounting records straw for bedding, in quantities, suggesting the bedding is changed infrequently. It records bread and ale, in quantities that are, by the caloric standards of medieval dietary assessment, adequate but not generous. It records the wages of one woman hired to clean a significant expense, suggesting the cleaning problem was severe enough to require paid outside labor rather than whatever internal arrangements had sufficed before. It records the replacement of 2 sets of iron manacles, which is its own kind of accounting, its own record of what kind of management was considered necessary. What it does not record, conspicuously, is any fuel for heating. No wood, no charcoal, no peat, in the winter. In London, with patients housed in stone rooms, this absence requires sitting with for a moment. It is possible, of course, that heating was arranged separately, that some other document records the fuel supply, that this one omits. It is possible that the priory's own fires provided some warmth to adjacent spaces. But the balance of evidence from Bethlem and from comparable institutions in the 13th and 14th centuries suggests that the systematic heating of patient wards was, at best, an afterthought, and at worst simply not considered. The thick stone walls that provided such excellent sound insulation and such robust containment were, in winter, the walls of a cold box. Stone has an enormous thermal mass. It absorbs heat slowly and releases it slowly, which means that a stone building that is not actively heated will, in a cold winter, become and remain profoundly cold, not just cool. Cold in a way that modern people rarely experience, except by accident. The kind of cold that penetrates clothing, that makes sustained sleep difficult, that concentrates its effects on the extremities and on the constitutionally vulnerable. That patients in these conditions suffered from cold is obvious. That cold was understood, within the medieval medical framework, as potentially therapeutic for certain conditions is also true and requires examination. The treatment of mania and frenzy, the hot, agitated conditions associated with excess of blood and yellow bile, included, in a number of medical texts, the use of cold environments, cold water, cold compresses to the head. The theory was straightforward. If the condition was one of excess heat, the remedy was the application of its opposite. Cold rooms were, in some treatments, an intended feature rather than an inadvertent consequence. The cold of the stone asylum could be, and in some medical contexts was, framed as part of the therapeutic environment. This is not a comfortable fact. It requires holding the possibility that some of the cruelty of these environments was genuinely believed, by some of the people responsible for them, to be good medicine. The cold that we look back on with horror was, from within a particular theoretical framework, not obviously wrong. It was the application of a principle, the correction of excess by its opposite, that had genuine medical authority behind it, that was supported by ancient precedent and contemporary practice, that would have been defended by any educated physician of the period, not as cruelty but as treatment. Understanding this does not excuse it. The people shivering in those stone rooms were suffering regardless of the theoretical justification, but it warns against the comfortable narrative in which medieval asylum care was simply ignorant brutality, simply the product of people who didn't know better or didn't care. The reality is more disturbing. Some of it was ignorant, some of it was indifferent, and some of it was the sincere application of a medical theory that was wrong in ways that its practitioners could not see because they had no framework from which to see it. All 3 kinds of failure produced the same cold rooms and the same suffering, but they have different implications for how we think about the history, and how we think about the possibility that our own sincere medical convictions are producing suffering we currently cannot see. The stone walls, then, held cold, but they also held something else, something that complicates the picture in ways that resist simple moral framing. They held safety. This requires context. The world outside the asylum walls was not a world of freedom and dignity for people whose minds had broken. It was the world we described in our first segment: the road, the jail, the violence, the exploitation, the casual brutality that a medieval city visited on those who were visibly different, visibly vulnerable, visibly unable to defend themselves. A person who left the walls of Bethlem or any comparable institution and returned to the streets of London in the 14th century was not returning to liberty. They were returning to a world that had already demonstrated its treatment of people like them, and that treatment was worse than cold stone rooms. This is the terrible paradox that the thick asylum walls embody. They were, simultaneously, a form of oppression and a form of protection. They imprisoned people who had committed no crime. They enforced a separation from ordinary life that was rarely reviewed, rarely challenged, rarely responsive to the patient's recovery or expressed wishes. They created conditions of physical discomfort and indignity that were defended by theory but produced by indifference. And they were, for a significant number of their occupants, the only reason those occupants were still alive. The historical record of escapes from medieval asylums is a record of this paradox in action. When patients escaped, and they did, regularly, through gates left open, through windows accessible from certain angles, through the gaps that opened in any institution when attention was elsewhere, the outcomes were mixed. Some escaped and remained free, returned to families who had regained the capacity to care for them, or found communities that accommodated their differences in the way that Gilles did. These escapes are not recorded because they ended well, and well-ending stories leave fewer traces in institutional records than catastrophes. What is recorded are the others: the patient who escaped and was found drowned in the Thames 3 days later, the patient who fled and was beaten to death in an alley in Cheapside by men who thought they were responding to a threat, the patient who disappeared and was never found, which, in the context of a medieval city and a vulnerable, potentially confused individual, is its own kind of ending. The keepers who responded to these outcomes by reinforcing the gates and the walls were not, or not only, motivated by the institutional desire to maintain control. They were, or some of them were, responding to the evidence of what happened when the walls failed. The walls were the record of these outcomes made permanent. Each escape that ended badly produced a new measure: a heavier gate, a higher wall, a window reduced in size, and the institution grew more secure, not only through policy, but through accumulated tragedy. There is a particular poignancy to this process. The institution was becoming more oppressive in direct response to evidence that the outside world was dangerous for its occupants. The more dangerous the outside proved, the thicker the walls grew, and the thicker the walls grew, the more the institution became a place that looked, from the outside, like pure confinement, and, from the inside, like the only available shelter. The walls created the very condition, a population with nowhere else to go, that justified their continued existence and incremental thickening. The cold logic of care then was this: the walls were terrible, and the walls were necessary, and the same walls that made life inside them worse than it needed to be, also made it possible. The same stone that held the cold and the dark and the smell and the chains was the stone that held the patient who might otherwise have drowned. The same architecture that confined also sheltered. The same enclosure that denied freedom also denied the world access to people who had discovered, through bitter experience, that the world's access was not something they could afford. Medieval care was not kind, but it was not nothing. And the thick walls that held it were not only what we now, rightly, condemn them for being, they were also the physical shape of a society doing, imperfectly and incompletely, and sometimes cruelly, what it could with what it had for people who had nothing. That is not absolution. It is not even defense, but it is necessary to the full account, because a history that sees only the chains and misses the drowned patient in the Thames is as incomplete as a history that sees only the shelter and misses the cold. Segment 6. The keepers expanded. His name was William, and beyond that the record gives us almost nothing. A visiting chronicler in the mid-15th century, stopping at Bethlem on a journey that seems to have been partly pastoral and partly a tour of the city's notable institutions, notes only that he encountered a warden of considerable experience, William the warden, who has been here these 30 years and knows each of his charges as a shepherd knows his flock. The metaphor is the chronicler's, not William's. William, if we could ask him, might have chosen differently. A shepherd's flock is owned. A shepherd's flock can be moved and sold and slaughtered. What William had in his galleries was something more like a permanent community, a collection of lives that had been delivered to him by the failure of every other arrangement that life offered, and that were now, for the duration of whatever years remained to them, his daily responsibility in the most complete and practical sense of that word. 30 years of walking those same galleries, in the same building, with the same categories of human need presenting themselves in an infinite variety of individual cases. 30 years of learning to read the particular quality of silence that preceded a violent episode, the particular brightness of eye that meant a patient was entering a phase of grandiosity rather than genuine recovery, the difference between the weeping that needed to be sat with and the weeping that needed to be left alone, the difference between the patient who was improving and the patient who only appeared to be improving because they had learned to perform wellness for the person doing the evaluating. 30 years of knowing which rooms were which had the best light in winter, which ran cold and damp, which created the echo that agitated certain patients and which absorbed sound in a way that others found genuinely calming. William is representative of a class of people whose contribution to the history of mental health care is almost entirely unrecorded. Not because it was small, but because it was made in the daily, unremarkable, non-textual register of human labor. The physicians who visited asylums wrote about their visits. The theologians who debated the nature of madness wrote treatises. The benefactors who funded the institutions wrote letters, deeds, endowments, commemorative prayers. The administrators who ran the priories wrote accounts. William wrote nothing. What he knew lived in his body, in his hands, and his voice, and his feet, navigating those corridors at 3 a.m, and when he died, it died with him, leaving only the chronicler's brief note as a trace that he existed at all. This is a significant loss, because what the Williamses of medieval asylum history knew, accumulated through long practice and irreplaceable proximity, was not inferior to what the physicians knew. In some respects, it was superior. They knew the patients as individuals rather than as cases. They knew the rhythms of individual illness with an intimacy that a physician visiting once a month could not approach. They knew what helped and what made things worse, not from theory, but from the evidence of thousands of repeated observations, the kind of empirical knowledge that is indistinguishable from care when it is functioning at its best. To understand the keepers is to understand that medieval asylums were not monolithic. They varied enormously in their quality, their character, their humanity, depending almost entirely on the people who ran them on a daily basis. The difference between a humane institution and a brutal one was not, in the medieval period, primarily a matter of policy or architecture. It was a matter of personnel. An institution run by a William, experienced, attentive, genuinely invested in the well-being of his charges, produced a different quality of life for its occupants than one run by the kind of keeper the records also describe, the ones who beat patients for entertainment, who stole their food allowances, who treated the institution as a license for small tyrannies carried out on people with no power to resist or complain. Both kinds existed. Both kinds were the product of the same institutional structure, the same architecture, the same thick walls. The walls did not determine the character of the keeper. They did, however, shape the range of what was possible, in both directions. Thick walls that absorbed sound made it easier for a humane keeper to manage a crisis without the whole institution dissolving into reactive panic. They also made it easier for an abusive keeper to do things that no one outside the walls would ever know about. The architecture was neutral between these possibilities in a way that is itself a kind of moral statement about what the institutions that built them considered important to control. The keepers lived with the architecture in a different way than the patients did. They were not contained by it. They moved freely. They went home, in theory, though in practice many slept on the premises, because the institution never fully stopped, because crises did not respect shifts, because the relationship between keeper and kept was too enmeshed for clean separation at the end of a working day. They learned the building the way you learn any space you inhabit for decades, completely, in the body rather than in the mind, as a map of practical possibilities, rather than an abstract structure. William knew, after 30 years, which walls could be felt vibrating before you heard the crisis on the other side of them. The very thick walls transmitted almost nothing acoustically, but the slightly thinner internal partitions would pick up rhythmic percussion and carry it as a subtle tremor. And William had learned to rest his hand on certain walls the way you might press your ear to a door, reading the institution's state through the stone. He knew where the building was warmest in February, a corner near the kitchen on the ground floor, where the chimney stack ran through the wall and shed heat into the adjacent room, and where certain patients could be moved in the depths of winter to sleep with something approaching comfort. He knew where the building became almost unbearable in summer, the south-facing upstairs rooms that turned into kilns by August, that needed their windows propped open in ways that created an escape risk, requiring the constant balancing act that kept management permanently at the edge of its own capacity. The thick walls were his medium. He worked in them and around them and through them the way a craftsman works in their material, learning its properties, exploiting them, compensating for its deficiencies. The wall that blocked sound was his ally in managing multiple simultaneous crises. The wall that held cold was his adversary in keeping vulnerable patients from pneumonia through the winter. The wall that created darkness, because the windows, cut narrow for security, admitted little light, was something he compensated for by managing the institution's rhythm around the daylight hours, by concentrating the activities that needed attention and human contact into the light, and leaving the darkness for the sleep that some patients achieved and others chased without finding. The relationship between the keeper and the walls extended to a particular kind of institutional memory that the walls themselves embodied. Medieval asylums were preliterate in their operational reality, even when written records were kept. The written records were administrative and financial. They did not record what had been tried with which patient and what had been discovered to help. They did not record the layout of individual patients' needs, their triggers, their calming strategies, their history within the institution. This knowledge lived in the heads of the keepers, passed on verbally when a keeper trained a successor, lost entirely when a keeper died without doing so. But some of it lived in the walls. The walls bore the marks of institutional history in ways that the keepers learned to read. A particular section of corridor floor worn smooth in a specific pattern by pacing feet. Someone had paced there for years, in that specific arc, and the stone remembered it. A doorframe with marks at shoulder height, repeated in patterns that suggested a patient who had stood there regularly. A windowsill with a groove worn by a hand resting in the same position day after day, year after year, until the friction of the palm made a small testimony in the stone. William knew these marks. He could have told you their stories, or the parts of their stories that lived in the institution's memory. The groove in the windowsill was made by a man who had been there before William arrived and died in his second year, who spent every afternoon he was given liberty to stand at that window, looking at the kitchen garden with an expression that William's predecessor had described as peaceful, and that William had never seen in anyone else within those walls. The groove was a kind of grave marker. The stone remembered what the records didn't. The keepers were the human interface between the institutions, abstract purposes, and the daily reality of people in profound need. They were underpaid, undersupervised, undertrained, and operating in conditions of chronic stress, with no psychological support and no framework for understanding what they were experiencing. That some of them were brutal is not surprising. That some of them were, within the limits of their world and their knowledge, genuinely kind. That some of them developed genuine attachments to the people in their care, genuine skills in managing their needs, genuine institutional wisdom is more remarkable and deserves more attention than history has generally given it. The thick walls shaped their work in every dimension. The walls were their tools and their constraints, their protection and their isolation, their daily environment and the physical expression of the institution's fundamental commitment to separation. And in learning to live and work within those walls for decades, keepers like William became something that had no name in the medieval world. The first practitioners of what we would eventually, centuries later, call psychiatric nursing, not because they had theory, because they had walls, and time, and 30 years of paying attention to the people inside them. The walls remembered, the keepers remembered, and between them, they held a knowledge about the nature of human suffering and what it required, that the physicians with their books and the theologians with their frameworks, and the administrators with their accounts, never quite captured, and never quite trusted, and never quite found a way to preserve. That knowledge is largely lost. What remains is the stone. Segment 7, Medicine Behind the Stone, expanded. By the 14th century, something was beginning to happen inside those thick walls that the walls themselves had not been designed to produce. Something tentative and uncertain and mixed so thoroughly with error and superstition that it would take centuries to separate. The genuine insight from the dross, but something real, nonetheless. Something that deserves the name of medical observation, even if it deserves almost no other medical honorific. Physicians were beginning to visit asylums. Not regularly, not as a matter of policy or institutional mandate. There was no structure that required it. No professional expectation that a physician's practice should include the management of the mentally ill. No curriculum in any European medical school that addressed the treatment of patients housed in institutions of this kind. The physicians who came for their own reasons. Curiosity, sometimes the genuine intellectual appetite of a well-trained mind confronting phenomena that his textbooks had described but his training had not prepared him to encounter. Occasionally, referral. A wealthy family whose member had been placed in Bethlem or a comparable institution retaining a physician to provide oversight, to provide the reassurance of professional attention. Occasionally, something approaching vocation, the physician who found, to his own surprise, that the patients behind the thick stone walls were more interesting to him than the wealthy households he attended, that the questions their conditions posed were more demanding and more alive than anything the ordinary practice of medicine required him to think about. What these physicians found, when they came and looked carefully, was a landscape that confounded their textbooks in specific and instructive ways. The humoral theory told them what to expect. It told them that a patient with an excess of yellow bile, the frenzied, raving, violent patient who had been brought to the institution in restraints, screaming about enemies and demons, tearing at his clothing, should respond to treatment directed at the hot, dry excess that was driving his condition, bleeding to reduce the volume of heated blood, contributing to the crisis, purging to expel the corrupted bile from the system, cool baths to moderate the excessive heat, dietary restriction, particularly the avoidance of foods that were themselves hot and dry, red meat, wine, spices, and the introduction of cooling, moistening foods, fresh vegetables, cold water, cooling herbs. The theory was internally consistent. It prescribed specific interventions with specific rationales, and when a physician carried out these interventions on a frenzied patient in an asylum ward, what happened? Sometimes the patient improved, sometimes the patient improved dramatically. The bleeding and purging produced a rapid physiological change. The patient's agitation decreased, sleep returned, the episode subsided. The physician recorded this as confirmation of the theory. Excess bile had been reduced, balance had been restored, the treatment had worked. What the physician had no way of assessing was whether the improvement was caused by the treatment or was simply the natural course of the episode reaching its conclusion, which it would have done with or without intervention. Manic and psychotic episodes do not last forever. They peak and they subside on timescales that have nothing to do with what the physician does in the meantime. If the physician applies treatment at any point during the episode, the eventual resolution will look like evidence for the treatment's efficacy. This is one of the oldest and most persistent traps in medical reasoning, and medieval physicians fell into it consistently, not because they were stupid, but because they had no method for distinguishing therapeutic effect from natural resolution. But here is where it gets interesting. Here is where the thick stone walls began to produce knowledge that the theory alone could not generate. Physicians who visited asylums repeatedly, over years, began to notice something that their textbooks had not prepared them for, that some patients, without any specific medical intervention, simply stabilized, not recovered, stabilized. The raving quieted. The melancholic slowly returned to a state in which they could eat, sleep, speak coherently. The patient who had been brought in screaming and had been housed and fed and kept from harming themselves began, over weeks and months, to reconstitute something that looked like ordinary functioning. No bleeding had done this, no purging, no specific medicine, nothing but the passage of time inside the walls. The physicians did not have the conceptual vocabulary to name what they were observing. They could not say. The removal of environmental stressors allowed the acute phase of this condition to resolve naturally. They could not say, structured routine, adequate nutrition, and physical safety are themselves therapeutic for certain presentations of mental illness. These formulations required a framework they didn't possess, a framework that would not fully exist until the 19th century's development of moral therapy and the 20th century's research into the role of stress and environment in psychiatric illness. But they observed the phenomenon. They recorded it. They noted, in their case descriptions and in the marginal comments of their texts, that patients housed in the asylum often did better than patients who remained in the community, and that this improvement could not always be attributed to specific treatments. Some of them drew the wrong conclusion from this, that confinement was itself therapeutic, that the asylum's walls had a direct medical virtue, that separation from the world was a form of treatment rather than a condition that allowed natural recovery to occur. This wrong conclusion would be enormously consequential, because it provided medical authority for institutional confinement that went well beyond what the evidence actually supported. If walls were medicine, then more walls for more patients for longer periods were more medicine, and the logic of expansion, of keeping people longer, of admitting more cases, of building larger and more permanent institutions, followed from the misattribution as naturally as water following gravity. But underneath the wrong conclusion was a right observation. Environment mattered. The removal of certain patients from certain environments produced genuine improvement. The stability of the institution, its regular rhythms, its removal of the demands and threats of ordinary social life, its provision of food and shelter without requiring the patient to perform the daily labor of survival, was not neutral. It had effects. It had, for some patients in some phases of their illness, measurable positive effects that the physicians could observe, even if they could not correctly interpret. The specific architecture of the stone building contributed to this in ways that were not entirely accidental. The thick walls that we have discussed for their acoustic and containment properties also produced a particular quality of temporal experience. Sound from the outside world was muffled. the ordinary markers of the city's day, the shouts of vendors, the bells of other churches, the accelerating and decelerating rhythm of commercial life, were attenuated by the stone to a distant texture rather than a constant demand. Inside the thick walls, time moved differently. Not slowly exactly, but regularly. The institution's rhythm imposed itself. The distribution of food, the lighting of candles, the opening and closing of gates, the morning prayers, if the institution retained its religious character, the routines of the keeper's day that became, by repetition, the routines of the patient's day. This regularity was, for certain kinds of mental illness, genuinely valuable. The person in the grip of severe depression, for whom every decision is an insuperable obstacle, every demand of ordinary life an impossibility, every interaction with other human beings a source of fresh suffering, found in the institution's rhythm a structure they did not have to generate for themselves. The day happened to them rather than requiring them to happen to it. They did not have to decide when to eat or when to sleep or what to do with the hours. The institution decided. The thick walls held the structure in place. Literally, the walls of the asylum were the walls of the therapeutic schedule, making escape from it, physical escape or temporal escape, the escape of simply doing something different, difficult or impossible. The physicians who observed this were not, for the most part, able to articulate why it helped. They fell back on the language of humoral balance. The institution's regularity balanced the humors, prevented the excess stimulation that agitated the bile, protected the vital spirits from the shocks that disrupted their proper flow. The language was wrong. The observation was not. There were also the physicians who observed the negative cases, the patients who did not improve, who remained in the institution for years or decades, who seemed to worsen rather than stabilize. These cases also confounded the textbooks, and they produced, in the most thoughtful observers, a category of question that the humoral theory was not well equipped to answer. What was different about these patients? Why did the same environmental removal that helped some seem to harm others? Why did certain patients seem to need something that the institution, however stable and regular its rhythms, could not provide? The answers that medieval physicians reached for were, again, framed in humoral language but pointed toward something real. Some conditions, the more careful observers noted, seemed to require active engagement rather than passive containment. The melancholic who retreated further into withdrawal when left alone with his withdrawal, who needed to be drawn out by conversation and activity and human contact, rather than simply housed and waited upon. The patient whose condition was driven not by humoral excess but by what one physician described as a lack of proper objects for the mind's attention, by the absence of meaningful occupation rather than the excess of stimulation. These observations were pointing, very gradually and incompletely, toward what the 19th century would call moral therapy. The understanding that mental illness was not only a medical condition requiring physical treatment, but a human condition requiring human engagement. But these insights, where they existed, were individual rather than institutional. They were the observations of particular physicians who happened to visit particular asylums and happened to pay particular kinds of attention. They were not transmitted into policy. They were not built into the architecture. The institutions themselves continued to be designed and operated on the logic of containment. And the physicians who saw beyond containment continued to work within buildings that were not designed for anything else. The walls remained thick, the windows remained narrow, the gates remained heavy. The stone continued to impose its logic of separation and enclosure on every attempt to imagine something different. And yet, inside those walls, in the spaces between the stone and the suffering, something was being learned, slowly, partially, against significant resistance, but learned. The physicians came and they looked, and they wrote in their case notes and their treatises about what they saw. And what they saw was not only what the theory predicted, and the difference between what the theory predicted and what they actually observed was the thin crack through which, eventually, something like modern psychiatry would begin to push its roots. The walls held the darkness. They also held the observation of the darkness. An observation, given enough centuries and enough observers, eventually becomes knowledge. Segment 8. The walls that spoke of God, expanded. To walk through the grounds of a 13th century religious hospital with the eyes of the people who built it is to understand immediately that nothing, not the placement of a door, not the angle of a window, not the proportion of a courtyard, was accidental. Medieval architecture was a theological statement made in stone, and the buildings that housed the sick and the suffering were among the most deliberate of all such statements. because they were the places where the gap between the divine promise of healing and the human reality of irremediable suffering was most nakedly visible, most urgently in need of architectural resolution. God healed the sick. This was foundational. The Gospels were full of it. The blind given sight, the lame made to walk, the lepers cleansed, the dead raised. The Church's charitable institutions were built on the theological premise that their work participated in this healing, that the care provided within their walls was continuous with the miraculous care of the New Testament, that the monk bringing broth to a fevered patient and Christ touching the eyes of the blind man were connected by a logic of divine love that made the monk's small act part of the larger redemptive story. This created an architectural problem. If your institution was a site of divine healing, how did its walls express that? How did stone and mortar and the proportion of a nave embody the theological claim that suffering encountered here would be met by grace? How did you build a building that held the worst of human experience, the screaming patient, the dying beggar, the person whose mind had dissolved into terror, and simultaneously proclaimed that this suffering was not abandoned, that it was known, that it was held within a larger order that had both the will and the power to redeem it? The medieval answer was comprehensive, systematic, and expressed in every detail of the built environment. Begin with orientation. Religious hospitals and the hospital wings of larger institutions were almost universally oriented on an east-west axis, with the chapel at the eastern end so that patients in their beds could see, or at minimum hear, the liturgy being performed at the altar where the sun rose. This was not merely ceremonial. It was a statement that the fundamental rhythm of the patient's day, their experience of time, their relationship to the institution's life, was anchored in the liturgical calendar, that they were located not just in a building but in a cosmic order that the building was designed to make perceptible. The ceilings of hospital wards in the great medieval charitable foundations were high, sometimes astonishingly high, in buildings that housed people who were too ill to raise their eyes above the middle distance. The height was not functional. A lower ceiling would have been warmer, easier to build, less expensive in materials and labor. The height was theological. It pointed upward. It insisted on the vertical dimension. It refused the purely horizontal logic of a room designed only for the efficient management of horizontal bodies. The high ceiling said, "This space is not only a practical container, it is a claim about where your suffering is located in the order of things. And where it is located is not in a sealed room with no sky above it, but in a world that opens upward toward something that high stone walls and high timber roofs can only gesture at, but cannot contain." The windows of religious hospitals were, where the budget allowed, places of extraordinary investment. Stained glass was enormously expensive. The cost of a single significant window could represent months of an institution's operating expenses. And yet, the great charitable foundations poured resources into their windows in ways that seem, from a purely practical standpoint, irrational. The light that entered through colored glass was technically inferior to the light that entered through clear glass. It was dimmer, more diffuse, harder to work by, but it was transformed light, light that had passed through a story, through a theological claim made in color and lead, through the image of a healing saint or a redemptive scene from Scripture. The patient who lay beneath that window and watched the light move across the floor as the day progressed was participating, every hour of every day, in a slow-moving image of sacred narrative. The thick walls of the asylum, in this context, were not only practical structures, they were the material support for this entire theological program. They were what made the orientation possible, what gave the windows their depth and their shadow, what created the enclosed acoustic space in which the liturgy could be heard, even through stone, what established the boundary between the sacred interior and the profane world outside. The walls were not the theology, they were what the theology was built on. For the mentally ill specifically, there was an additional layer of theological meaning encoded in the thick stone of their wards. The Christian tradition's understanding of madness was never single or simple, but one of its persistent threads was the association of mental disturbance with spiritual disturbance, the loss of the rational soul's proper functioning as a symptom, perhaps, of its distance from God, or as the site of active demonic interference, or as the particular suffering that God permitted as a form of purification or trial. This meant that the mad person was, within the theological framework, not merely sick but in a state of heightened spiritual urgency. Their need for the Church's ministrations was not less than that of the physically ill but greater, because the stakes were not only bodily but eternal. The walls that enclosed the mad were therefore walls that enclosed a particularly intense site of spiritual need and spiritual activity. The prayers offered within them were prayers offered on behalf of souls in extraordinary distress. The sacraments administered within them, confession, last rites, the Eucharist where it was made available, were sacraments administered to people whose relationship to the divine was complicated by the very condition of their minds, whose capacity to receive grace in the ordinary way was disrupted by the disruption of the faculties through which grace was ordinarily received. Medieval theologians debated this question with genuine seriousness. Could a person who was not in possession of their reason receive the benefit of the sacraments? Could someone who could not articulate their sins make a valid confession? Could someone who did not fully understand what the Eucharist was receive its grace? The architecture of the asylum absorbed this theological anxiety. The chapel was close, often directly adjacent to or visible from the patient wards. The rhythm of the hours was audible within the walls through the ringing of the bell, making the divine office present as sound even for those who could not participate in it as rational actors. The very solidity of the building, its thickness, its permanence, its resistance to change and to the passage of time, was a statement that the institution would persist, that the prayers would continue to be offered, that the spiritual attention directed at the suffering within the walls would not cease even when the individual patient could not sustain their own claim on it. There was also the matter of the institution's saints. Every religious hospital was dedicated to a saint whose intercessory power was understood to extend to the patients within it. Bethlem was dedicated to the Virgin Mary, specifically to Our Lady of Bethlehem, the Mother of God who had borne in a stable the incarnation of divine love. The choice was not random. It was a theological statement about the kind of presence the institution was meant to embody. The maternal, unconditional, not requiring, worthiness before extending care quality of Marian intercession. The thick stone walls of Bethlem were, in the minds of those who built them and maintained them, walls standing under the specific protection and within the specific patronage of the figure whose mercy was most reliably invoked for those who had no other advocate. The saints, whose relics were housed in chapel and whose images appeared in window and sculpture, were also understood as active participants in the therapeutic environment. The pilgrim who came to a healing shrine and was cured was not thought to be cured by the atmosphere or the stone or the rest. They were cured by the saint's specific intercession with God, a transaction that required the pilgrim's faith and the saint's continued active engagement with the welfare of the living. The patients in a religious hospital were permanently located within the zone of such intercession. They did not need to make a pilgrimage. The pilgrimage location had been built around them. The walls enclosed a sacred geography, a place where the boundary between heaven and earth was understood to be thinner than elsewhere, where the saint's attention was reliably available because the building had been specifically constructed to attract and maintain it. This is not nothing. This requires taking seriously not as superstition but as psychological fact. The person in the grip of severe depression, convinced of their own damnation, certain they were beyond the reach of any mercy, lived within a physical environment that contradicted their certainty at every point. The walls said, "You are in a place that is specifically dedicated to those in your condition." The windows said, "The story of healing is being told around you even when you cannot hear it." The bell said, "The prayers continue, in their regular order, whether you can participate or not." The chapel said, "The sacred is close, not distant. You are not required to travel to it. It has built itself around you." Whether any of this helped in ways we would now consider therapeutically significant is impossible to determine from the historical distance. There are accounts mostly hagiographic, mostly shaped by the conventions of miracle narrative rather than by anything we would call clinical observation of patients in religious hospitals who experienced sudden and apparently genuine recoveries associated with prayer, with relics, with the liturgical calendar. The feast day of the institution's patron saint was understood to be a time of heightened healing potential, and there are records of patients who emerged from prolonged states of disturbance around these feast days in ways that the community around them attributed directly to saintly intercession. We cannot verify these accounts. We cannot separate genuine remission of psychiatric illness from the natural course of episodic conditions, from the placebo effects of hope and community attention, from the shaping influence of narrative convention on how events were recorded. But we can note that the expectation of healing, the community's attention focused on the sick person, the meaning-making framework that located their suffering within a redemptive story. These are not nothing. They are, in fact, factors that modern psychiatric research identifies as having genuine impact on treatment outcomes. The theology was wrong about the mechanism. The architecture it produced was not entirely wrong about the therapeutic value of meaning, expectation, and community attention. The walls that spoke of God were thick because permanence was a theological virtue. They were thick because what they enclosed was understood to be serious as any sacred site, as demanding of substantial investment as any place where heaven and earth met. They were thick because the people who built them believed, with full conviction, that the suffering within them was real and mattered, and was not abandoned by the divine, even when it was beyond human cure. That conviction produced architecture that was, in its way, a form of respect. Imperfect, mixed with ignorance and error, failing in practical ways while succeeding in symbolic ones, but an attempt, encoded in stone, to say that the people inside the walls were worth the investment of permanence. The walls still stand. The theology that drove them is no longer universal, but the impulse that built them, the impulse to say that suffering is serious, that it deserves serious architecture, that the person in crisis deserves to be located within a structure that takes their situation with full and unreduced gravity. That impulse is not entirely foreign to what we still, in our own imperfect way, are trying to build. Segment 9, Escapes and What They Proved, expanded. In 1403, an official survey of Bethlem recorded 6 patients. Of these, 3 were in chains. 2 were described as having been in the institution for extended periods, years, not months. 1 was recorded as destitute and without any family connection capable of receiving him, even if he were deemed fit for release. The chains are what people remember from this record, and rightly, they are the most visceral evidence of what the institution was and what it did to the people inside it. But the record also contains, almost as an administrative afterthought, embedded in a section dealing with property and maintenance, a note about repairs to the perimeter wall on the north side of the building, where the mortar had deteriorated and several stones had come loose. The note records that the deterioration was to be remedied as a matter of urgency, and it does not explain why it was urgent, but the urgency is not mysterious. The wall had been a means of escape, or it was a potential means of escape, or someone had tried to make it one. The record doesn't specify. What it specifies is the response. Fix it immediately, make it sound, restore its integrity. The institution's anxiety about its perimeter was not administrative abstraction. It was the accumulated anxiety of years of managing what happened when the perimeter failed. The history of asylum escapes is one of the hidden architectures of institutional mental health care. A history told, not in the main narrative, but in the footnotes, in the repair records, in the coroner's inquests, in the occasional chronicle entry that records what happened to a patient who got out. It is a history that shaped the walls more directly than any theoretical consideration of medicine or theology, because it was the history of consequences, real, specific, documented consequences that the institution's administrators had to respond to, and that the keepers had to live with. The medieval city that surrounded Bethlem was not a safe environment for a person in acute psychological distress who appeared suddenly within it, without preparation or orientation. It was a city of approximately 80,000 people in a space that modern urban planners would find bewildering in its density and complexity. A city of narrow lanes and sudden open spaces, of crowds and solitudes pressed against each other without transition, of noise levels that even its habituated residents found taxing on feast days when commerce and celebration competed at full volume. For a person who had been living within the controlled, rhythmic, enclosed environment of the institution, a person whose contact with the unpredictable had been limited for months or years to the manageable unpredictability of a small institutional community, stepping into the medieval city would have been something close to sensory catastrophe. The Thames was everywhere and always. The river was the city's main thoroughfare, its garbage dump, its boundary, and its spine, running through the middle of everything at a speed and a depth that made it permanently, casually lethal. People fell into the Thames. People were thrown into the Thames. People walked into the Thames in moments of crisis without quite deciding to do so. For a person in acute distress, disoriented, moving without direction through streets they might not recognize, the river was a hazard so constant and so proximate that it required no particular intention to become a fatality. The record of patients who escaped and drowned in the Thames is not large. The records of medieval London are not comprehensive enough to produce large numbers of anything, but it is consistent enough across different institutions and different periods to establish the pattern clearly. Escape from asylum to river to death was not a rare tragedy. It was a recognized pathway, a specific risk that the institution's administrators understood and responded to by reinforcing the walls between their patients and the water. The asylum near Bishopsgate was not on the river, but the city between it and the Thames was navigable in the dark, and a person moving quickly and without clear awareness of their surroundings could cover the distance in less time than a keeper who was still discovering the absence. The violence of the city against escaped patients was another consistent pattern. A person in a state of visible psychological crisis, raving, confused, dressed in the institutional clothing that marked them as coming from a specific kind of place, was a target in the medieval city in several overlapping ways. They were a target for robbery. Whatever small possessions they had escaped with, their vulnerability was obvious, and the city had no shortage of people willing to exploit obvious vulnerability. They were a target for violence rooted in fear. The person visibly raving, visibly not in ordinary possession of themselves, who appeared suddenly in a lane or a market or a churchyard, was understood by many of those who encountered them as supernaturally threatening, possessed, contaminated, dangerous in a spiritual sense that authorized a physical response. There are records of escaped patients beaten by groups of men who described their motivation as protection of the neighborhood from malign influence. The beating was not considered legally problematic. The patient had no status that constrained what could be done to them in the street. There were also the escapes that ended not in violence or water but in recapture, and recapture itself was its own kind of violence. The rough, undignified process of returning a person by force to an institution that they had chosen to leave, through streets that treated the spectacle of recapture as entertainment. These events were not private. They happened in public. Neighbors watched. Children followed at a distance. The recaptured patient was, for the duration of their recapture and return, a spectacle. Their loss of control and loss of dignity public. Their helplessness visible to everyone who happened to be in the street at the time. Every escape that ended badly, in drowning, in violence, in the spectacle of recapture, was recorded in the institution's memory, even when it was not recorded in its documents. The keepers who had experienced these outcomes developed a specific relationship to the perimeter. They checked it. They were attentive to it, in the way that people are attentive to things that have failed them catastrophically, and might fail them again. They noted the deteriorating mortar, the gate hinge that had worked loose, the window whose bars were not quite close enough together for absolute security. And they reported these deficiencies, and the deficiencies were addressed, and the walls were repaired and reinforced and, over time, made more solid than they had been before the escapes happened. This is the process by which the walls grew thicker over time, not from initial design but from operational iteration. The original walls were sized according to what the builders thought necessary, which was their best estimate, based on general experience with institutional construction, rather than specific experience with this population. The iterations came after the patient who got through the gap in the north wall, after the one who used a loose stone as a step to reach the window ledge, after the one who waited by the gate every morning until a delivery arrived and the gate was open and the keeper's attention was on the cart rather than the yard. Each of these stories produced a specific architectural response, and the accumulation of specific architectural responses over years and decades produced walls that were thicker, gates that were heavier, windows that were smaller, perimeters that were more continuously attentive to themselves. What is philosophically interesting about this process is that it was driven not by abstract concern about what might happen, but by concrete memory of what had happened. The medieval asylum's architectural evolution was empirical in the most direct sense. It was shaped by evidence, by the specific evidence of specific failures, by the institution's accumulated record of how its physical fabric had been overcome and what the overcoming had cost. This is a form of learning. It is not the kind of learning we now consider ethically adequate. It is learning that happened entirely within the frame of containment, learning that took every failure as evidence that more containment was needed, rather than as evidence that the containment model itself might need revision. It never asked whether the patient who escaped and drowned might have drowned because the institution had contributed to a state of despair that made the river an inviting prospect. It never asked whether the patient who was beaten in the street might have been better served by a different relationship to the community that beat them. It asked only, where did the perimeter fail, and how do we prevent it from failing in the same place again? But within its frame, the learning was genuine. The walls became, over time, genuinely more effective at containing the people inside them. Whether that effectiveness was entirely to those people's benefit is a different and deeply uncomfortable question that the institution's architects were not equipped or inclined to ask. But the process was real, and it was driven by a form of institutional experience that has direct continuity with how institutions still learn from failure today. There is also a truth about escapes that cuts against the simple narrative of confinement and coercion. Some patients did not want to escape. Some of them had tried the outside and come back, or been brought back, and then gradually settled into something that looked less like imprisonment and more like acceptance, less like defeat and more like a pragmatic accommodation with the fact that the institution, however imperfect, was the only stable environment available to them. The keeper, William, with his 30 years, would have known patients like this. He would have known the ones who had been returned 3 times and who no longer tried. Not because they had been broken, but because they had understood, in the way that you understand things that you have tested against the evidence of your own experience, that outside the walls there was nothing for them, and inside the walls there was at least straw and bread and the routine of a known day. This is a devastating form of accommodation. It represents a failure of the society around those walls, so complete that the walls themselves had ceased to be the primary injustice. The primary injustice being the absence of any alternative. The absence of family support, the absence of community resources, the absence of any place in the ordinary world that could hold someone whose ordinary functioning had broken down without requiring from them a performance of normality they could no longer sustain. The walls that grew thicker in response to escapes were not only walls around the patients, they were walls around a social failure that the institution made visible but could not solve. Every repair to the perimeter was a response to a symptom. The underlying condition, a society that had no place for its most vulnerable members except behind stone, was not a problem that more stone could address. But more stone was what the institution knew how to provide. And more stone was what it provided, year after year, escape after escape, tragedy after tragedy, until the walls were as thick as they needed to be to hold what needed holding, and thicker still, because safety margins in architecture always reflect the fear of the builder. And the fear of the builders of asylum walls was not theoretical. It was the specific, embodied, inescapable memory of what happened when the walls were not thick enough. Segment 10. The city beyond the wall expanded. Stand at the gate of Bethlem on a February morning in 1380. Do not go inside. Simply stand at the gate, your back to the institution, and let the city come to you. The city does not wait for your permission. It arrives all at once, in the way that medieval cities always arrive, not gradually, not with a polite sequential introduction of separate sensory inputs, but as a single overwhelming fact. Smell first, perhaps, because smell in a medieval city travels ahead of everything else. Wood smoke from 100 hearths, the riverine complexity of the Thames, 200 yards south, with its cargo of everything the city had decided to make the river's problem. The particular animal density of a city where horses and pigs and chickens share the streets with their human counterparts and contribute accordingly to the atmospheric record. Underneath the dominant notes, the more specific registers, fresh bread from the board, and the bread is almost ready 3 doors down. And the bread is almost ready, and the smelterly is almost a benning, and the bread is almost agent, and the smell as it is almost in the smell, it's a spix in the small, it is spoil, it's spoil, it's so it's okay, it's it, now it's it off, it with a sad say, who can hide, hug will bath, with sack to set, correct, good, but perhaps, where the that does that bath, thou with the half back, old gug, dark, skek, and at that, as biscuit, well, about cat will get this with cooler with the soft with fish from the market to the east, which has been operating since first light and has already decided to commit fully to the olfactory aspect of its trade. The cold February air itself, which carries a particular quality of ice and soot, and the faintly mineral smell of frozen mud that is specific to this city in this season, and that anyone who spent childhood here would recognize across decades and distance as the smell of home. Then sound, arriving in layers, the Thames, always, its low continuous voice beneath everything else. The sounds of oars and cargo, and the complaints of men who work on water before dawn in February. church bells from St. Botolph, without Bishopsgate, just to the north. The first bells of the day, establishing the hours in the way that bells in medieval cities do, not just as information but as a kind of acoustic territory, marking each church bell, asserting its presence and its neighborhood, the whole city navigating itself by sound as much as by sight. The early traffic on the lane, a cart with an unoiled wheel that announces itself long before it appears, the heavy, deliberate sound of laden hooves on frozen ground, a voice calling something to someone around a corner in the specific carrying tone of a person who has decided that the cold means they will shout their entire conversation rather than walking close enough to speak at a normal volume. Children somewhere. Already, the surprising fact of a medieval morning that children are always already awake and already running, already shouting at each other across distances that adults would cover in silence. A dog announcing something at length and with conviction. The bells of a different church responding to St. Botolph's bells, as if in argument. There are different tones and different rhythms creating, for a few seconds, a kind of accidental polyphony before the silence between peals swallows both. All of this arrives at you in the time it takes to stand still and breathe. This is the ordinary atmosphere of a winter morning in 14th century London, unremarkable to those who live within it, as taken for granted as the cold, as noticed as the air itself, which is to say barely consciously at all, registered and processed and absorbed without particular attention by minds that have been calibrating to this specific sensory environment since childhood. Now turn round, walk through the gate and let it close behind you, and feel the city change. The change is not instantaneous. The stone walls of Bethlem are thick, but they are not perfect, and the city does not vanish entirely. What happens instead is a transformation, a filtering, a reduction of the city to something fundamentally different in quality. The wheel on the cart is still there, somewhere, but it is no longer a specific sound with a specific location in the lane to your left. It is a texture, a low-frequency presence that you feel more than hear, a ghost of the thing itself. The church bells survive better than most sounds. They have the carrying quality that their designers intended, and they can reach through stone with more authority than human voices, but they too are changed, softened, stripped of their directional information so that they arrive from everywhere at once, rather than from a specific tower in a specific direction. The fish smell, gone, or nearly. The bread, a trace, a suggestion, enough to remind you that it exists, but not enough to make a claim on your attention. What you smell inside the walls is the inside, the straw and the damp stone and the particular human smell of many people in a confined space without adequate ventilation. The smell that medieval people who visited institutions like this one noted in their accounts with a consistency that suggests it was striking even by the standards of a world that was not squeamish about smell. What you hear, clearly and without competition from the city, is the institution itself. A voice, somewhere in the interior, speaking in the rapid muttering rhythm that you learn to recognize as the particular register of someone in private conversation with an audience only they can see. The sound of a door opening and closing in a distant corridor. Footsteps, the keeper making his morning rounds, or the woman hired to clean, or a patient given liberty to move through certain parts of the building during the day. Somewhere, deeper in, the sound of weeping, quiet, sustained, the kind that has been going on for so long that the person doing it has lost any expectation that it will stop, or that anyone will come. The city, which was everywhere 30 seconds ago, is now an abstraction. It exists as a rumor, as a vibration, as the occasional shout that carries enough force to penetrate even the thick stone, and arrive in the pegstone as a ghost of itself, stripped of its context, stripped of the visual and environmental information that would make it mean something rather than simply sound like something. For the patients living inside those walls, the city exists in exactly this form, not as a lived reality, but as a distant, incomprehensible transmission, a series of sounds without sources, a world that can be felt but not navigated, that makes itself present as sensation, but refuses to cohere into the kind of information that would allow a response. The relationship between the institution's interior world and the city's exterior world was, from the inside, profoundly disorienting, and this disorientation was itself part of the experience of the asylum in ways that were not fully intended and not fully acknowledged. The patient who had been brought in from the city, however distressed, had been part of the city's sensory world. They knew how to navigate it, in the way that you know how to navigate any environment you have spent years learning in the body, below conscious attention, the constant automatic processing that lets you walk through a familiar neighborhood without deciding anything. Inside the thick walls, that knowledge became suddenly useless. The city's sounds arrived without their visual context, without the spatial information that made them navigable, without the social cues that made them meaningful. The world outside became genuinely alien, present but incomprehensible, heard but not understood, as strange as the sound of a language you once knew and have almost entirely forgotten. This strange relationship between inside and outside was, for the city as a whole, rather than the individual patient, a social and moral technology, as much as an architectural one. The city had made a collective decision, not a conscious, deliberate decision, but the kind of distributed social decision that accumulates through individual choices and institutional habits until it crystallizes into something as solid as policy, that certain forms of suffering would be housed rather than witnessed. The thick walls were the material form of this decision. They did not eliminate the suffering. They made it possible not to encounter it. They created, between the ordinary citizen going about their day on the other side of the wall and the patient in acute crisis on the inside, a barrier that was not only physical but perceptual. You did not have to see it, hear it directly, navigate around it, be interrupted by it in the way that you would have to be if those people were on the street, rather than behind stone. This was morally convenient in a way that the city did not examine. The existence of the institution allowed the city to believe, without exactly needing to articulate the belief, that it had addressed the problem, that the people behind the walls were being cared for, that the institution had taken on the responsibility, that the ordinary citizen's obligation to the suffering of their neighbors had been discharged by the existence of a specialized building with a specialized function. The thick walls enabled this belief by making the suffering invisible, out of sight, in the most literal architectural sense, behind stone that absorbed not only sound but, perhaps more importantly, conscience. The city looked at Bethlem and saw an institution. It did not, most of the time, look at Bethlem's walls and ask what was on the other side of them in any sustained or uncomfortable way. The walls were sufficiently thick that the question did not press itself upon the passerby. You could walk along Bishopsgate with the institution at your back and not think about it once. This is not the same as not caring, but it is, in practice, very close to it. And yet, the relationship was not only convenience and avoidance. There were people in that city, physicians, clerics, the occasional wealthy individual motivated by genuine compassion, or by the complex mix of compassion and social display that charitable giving has always involved, who looked at those walls and did not look away, who walked through the gate and engaged with what was inside, who brought money, food, their professional skills, their prayers, their attention. The walls that made it possible to walk past also made it possible for those who chose to stop, to enter a space that was specifically organized around the need that the rest of the city was organized around avoiding. The walls created, in this sense, a voluntary encounter with what the city had chosen to separate, a voluntary encounter that, because it was voluntary, was potentially more meaningful than the involuntary encounters that occurred when the suffering was simply part of the street, the charitable visitor, the physician making his rounds, the cleric performing the last rites for a dying patient. These people had chosen to enter. The walls around them were not walls confining them, but walls they had decided to pass through, and in passing through them had accepted a relationship with what was inside that their neighbors, outside, did not share. The walls were a threshold. They separated not only the city from the asylum, but the people who were willing to cross the threshold from those who were not. They made the encounter with extreme suffering optional, in a way that the encounter with suffering on the street was not, and in making it optional, they gave the encounter a different moral character, not better necessarily, but different, charged with the specific quality that voluntary engagement with difficulty always carries. The city beyond the wall was the ordinary world, the world of commerce and bread baking and church bells and frozen mud and children, running before dawn and dogs announcing things of indeterminate importance. It was a world that had decided, without quite deciding, to locate its most difficult members behind stone and then carry on. It was a world that contained, within its ordinary rhythms, the people who would occasionally walk through the gate, and the many more who never would. It was a world that could feel the thick walls without touching them, that was aware of the institution the way you are aware of a difficult truth that you are not quite ready to address, peripherally, uncomfortably, always just slightly at the edge of conscious attention. The walls stood between those two worlds. They held each from the other. They made both possible: the ordinary world of the city and the extraordinary world of the asylum, by insisting on their separation. And in insisting on that separation with 4 feet of stone, they encoded a truth about the city that the city preferred to experience as architecture rather than as moral fact. That ordinary life, as the city organized it, had room for some kinds of people and not others, and that the people it had no room for were nevertheless there, behind the stone, audible as a rumor, present as an anxiety, managed by the walls into a condition that allowed the city to continue functioning without quite resolving the question that their presence raised. The walls were the city's answer to a question it was not ready to fully ask. Segment 11. The legacy in the stone expanded. By the 16th century, the model had spread with the particular urgency that successful institutional solutions always carry when the problem they address is universal and the alternatives are clearly inadequate. From London, from Valencia, from the great charitable foundations of northern Italy and the religious hospitals of France, the asylum had become recognizable as a type, a category of building with a specific function and a specific architectural vocabulary. If you were a city official in a prosperous European city in the year 1530, and you were confronted with the problem of what to do with your city's mentally ill population, you no longer needed to invent a solution from nothing. The solution existed. It had existed, in various forms, for 3 centuries. You sent someone to observe it, or you read accounts of it, or you hired an architect who had built one before, and you built the thing: a walled compound, stone construction, institutional rhythm, specialized staff. The thick stone walls were not a specification that you debated. They were simply what the building was made of, because that was what buildings of this type were made of, and buildings of this type were made of it, because that was what worked, and what worked was what you built. The Narrenturm in Vienna, completed in 1784 at what seems like a significant temporal remove, but in fact represents the direct continuation of a tradition unchanged in its fundamentals since Bethlem's 13th century foundation, is among the most architecturally extreme expressions of this accumulated logic. Circular in plan, 5 stories tall, its thick outer wall interrupted by tiny windows arranged in regular rows around the circumference. It is a building that has given up any pretense of being anything other than what it is. The monastery had shaped the early asylum, the cloister, the chapel, the sense of sacred enclosure. The prison had shaped the early asylum, the heavy gate, the perimeter wall, the explicit logic of containment. The Narrenturm abandoned the monastery entirely and completed the merger with the prison, producing a building of such unambiguous institutional authority that looking at it now produces an immediate physical response. The walls speak without metaphor. They are speaking, and what they say is not complicated. They say, permanence. They say, the people inside this building are inside this building and will remain so. They say, we have decided that this is where this kind of person goes, and the stone says so. And the stone does not argue back. And the stone does not change its mind in the morning. And the stone will outlast everyone who disagrees with it. The Narrenturm's circular plan adds an additional dimension to this statement. The circle has no privileged viewpoint, no entrance side and backside, no better and worse prospect, no point from which the building looks different than from any other point. It is continuous, undifferentiated, equally assertive in every direction, and its curve means that no patient housed within it can see past the wall to the world beyond. The radius is too small. The wall curves away too quickly. You can see wall, and you can see the small sky above the central courtyard, and you cannot see anything else. The circle is a perfect enclosure, a built argument that the world beyond the wall has ceased, for the purposes of those living within it, to be relevant. Compare this to the Bethlem of 3 centuries earlier, which retained, however inadequately, the institutional character of a priory, a building type that included gardens, that included courtyards where light and air could be encountered, that included the possibility, even within the enclosure, of orientation toward something beyond the immediate stone. The Narrenturm has eliminated this possibility with architectural precision. There is no orientation toward the outside. The outside has been formally cancelled by the building's geometry. The walls have completed their logic. The Narrenturm is historically unusual in the explicitness of its architectural statement. Most European asylums of the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries retained some of the residual ambiguity of their origins in religious charitable institutions, some space between the logic of containment and the language of care. some architectural feature that could be pointed to as evidence of therapeutic intent. But the general trajectory was clear, as asylums became more explicitly dedicated to their function, as the religious and charitable context that had originally produced them became less central to their operation, as they grew larger and housed more patients and became more dependent on formal staff structures and institutional procedures rather than the pastoral relations of their monastic origins. The architecture became more thoroughly organized around containment and less organized around anything else. The great county asylums of 9th century Britain and Ireland represent the full flowering of this tradition at maximum scale. The County Asylums Act of 1808 and its successors mandated that every county in England and Wales build an asylum for its pauper lunatics, a legal obligation that produced over the following century one of the largest institutional building programs in British history. These were not small facilities. The asylum at Colney Hatch in Middlesex, opened in 1851, was designed to house over 1,000 patients at a time when it was built, and eventually housed over 3,000. The Carlow District Lunatic Asylum in Ireland, the Nottinghamshire County Pauper Lunatic Asylum, the Crichton Royal in Dumfries. These were enormous buildings, constructed at enormous expense, conceived as permanent solutions to a permanent problem, and built every one of them in the architectural vocabulary that had been established in 1247 at Bishop. Thick stone walls, heavy gates, long corridors that allowed surveillance from a single point, substantial perimeter walls around grounds that were themselves enclosed, small windows set high in deep reveals, admitting light without view, providing ventilation without access. The 19th century added refinements that the medieval period had not managed: more systematic heating, more sophisticated ventilation, gardens designed on therapeutic principles, the airing courts where patients could walk in the open air within the asylum's perimeter. These were genuine improvements, but the fundamental architectural language was continuous. The stone was the same stone, or its 19th century industrial equivalent. The walls were the same walls, thicker and more precisely engineered, but identical in their logic. The statement they made, "This is where this kind of person goes, and this is what staying there looks like," had not changed in 600 years. The Kirkbride Plan, developed by American psychiatrist Thomas Story Kirkbride in the 1850s and implemented in dozens of state hospitals across the United States, represented the most ambitious attempt to embed therapeutic principles into the architecture of large-scale institutional confinement. Kirkbride believed, with genuine conviction and some genuine empirical support, that the physical environment of the asylum had direct therapeutic effects, that the proper organization of space, light, air, and prospect could actively support the recovery of patients in ways that went beyond mere containment. His buildings were laid out in a distinctive staggered wing plan that maximized light and ventilation, included carefully designed grounds with views of pastoral landscape, provided spaces for work and recreation within the institutional perimeter. They were also built in stone, enormous quantities of stone. The Kirkbride buildings were, by any measure, among the most substantial pieces of construction in mid-19th century America, their walls thick, their foundations deep, their stone facades asserting permanence and authority in a landscape that was otherwise built in wood. Kirkbride explicitly connected the permanence of the building material to the therapeutic effect. He believed that the solidity and permanence of the institution communicated stability and safety to patients whose primary experience was one of instability and danger. The stone was part of the treatment. The thick walls were medicine. He was both right and wrong in the way that the medieval monks who first built asylum walls had been right and wrong. Right that the physical environment shaped the therapeutic experience, wrong about the specific mechanism, and insufficiently attentive to the ways in which the same walls that expressed permanence and safety also expressed confinement and chronicity. The message that you are here because you belong here, and here is a very solid and very permanent place, and the permanence of the place implies something about the permanence of your belonging to it. The legacy in the stone is not only architectural, it is this: that the model established in the 13th century shaped not just what buildings looked like, but what mental illness meant in social and institutional terms. The thick walls created a category, the institutionalized person, that persisted for 700 years, and that the walls themselves continuously reinforced. Once you have built a very large, very permanent, very expensive institution for a particular population, you have created a powerful incentive to fill it, to keep it filled, to define its population in ways that maintain its occupancy, and to maintain the institutions themselves because the buildings are too expensive and too impressive to simply abandon, even when your understanding of the problem they address has changed. The 19th century's enormous asylums were built by people who genuinely believed they were solving a problem. By the time their inadequacy became undeniable, by the time the conditions within them had deteriorated to the point of scandal, by the time a series of reformers and journalists and patients, advocates, had made the case that the institutions were causing harm rather than providing cure, the walls were so thick, the buildings so substantial, the investments so enormous, that the response was not to question whether the institutional model was fundamentally flawed, but to ask how the institutions could be reformed. The walls outlasted the theory that had produced them. The stone was more durable than the ideas that had shaped it. The deinstitutionalization movement of the mid to late 20th century, the large-scale closure of psychiatric hospitals in Britain, the United States, and elsewhere, driven by a combination of new pharmaceutical treatments, changing therapeutic philosophies, legal challenges to involuntary confinement, and, in many cases, straightforward fiscal pressure finally broke the logic of the thick stone walls at the level of policy. But the buildings themselves remained, and what happened to them is its own kind of historical statement about the relationship between permanence, investment, and social meaning. Some became hospitals for other populations, geriatric wards, rehabilitation centers, the institutional function continuing while the specific population changed. Some became universities, their long corridors and solid construction lending themselves to a different kind of institutional life. Some became what they are now most visibly: luxury apartments, hotels, art centers, expensive conversions in which the thick walls and generous proportions of the original buildings are treated as architectural assets rather than instruments of confinement. The irony of this transformation, that the walls built to contain the city's most unwanted members have become the defining feature of some of the most desirable real estate in the country, is not lost on historians of institutional psychiatry, though it is perhaps lost on the residents who pay premium prices to live inside them. And some became ruins, buildings too large to convert economically, too contaminated by association to attract private investment, too solid to demolish cheaply. They stand in landscapes across Britain and Ireland and North America, their walls intact, their roofs collapsed, trees growing through the floors of their former galleries. These ruins are, perhaps, the most honest form that the legacy has taken, the walls still standing, stripped of the institutional function that justified them, the bare stone carrying the memory of what happened within them without the context that might make that memory legible. The legacy in the stone is the legacy of a solution that outlasted the problem it was designed to solve, repeatedly outlasted the humoral theory, outlasted the theological framework, outlasted the 19th century's therapeutic optimism, outlasted the 20th century's institutional commitments, and continued to outlast, in its thick stone walls and deep foundations, every revision of the framework that had produced it. This is what building in stone means. Stone says, whatever you believe right now, this will persist past the moment when you change your mind. Segment 12. What the walls still say expanded. Walk into the ruins of an old asylum on a grey afternoon in autumn. Not the converted ones, not the luxury apartments with their original stone facades and their period features and their estate. Agent copy about character and history, the actual ruins, the ones that were too large or too remote or too thoroughly associated with suffering to attract the investment that would have tidied them into something palatable. There are places in the British Isles, in rural Ireland, in the landscapes of upstate New York and the American Midwest, where these buildings still stand in various degrees of decomposition, walls intact to their full height, roofs long gone, the sky where the ceiling used to be. Rooks nesting in the stone where decades ago patients slept and wept and stared at the underside of the roof and counted the days or gave up counting them. Stand in one of those rooms. Do not try to imagine the people who were here. You cannot do it adequately, and the attempt produces a sentimentality that is itself a kind of dishonesty, the comfortable sadness of imagining others suffering from the position of someone who can leave. Instead, just look at what is actually there. The walls. They are remarkable. That is the first and most unavoidable thing about them. They are remarkable as pure construction, as an expression of human intention made physical at very large scale. The stone is cut and fitted with a precision that speaks of significant skill and significant labor of men who knew their craft and applied it fully. whose professional pride was expressed in the quality of the joints and the plumb of the courses and the clean horizontal runs of the mortar lines. The walls were not built carelessly. They were built by people who were good at building, who understood that a wall of this thickness, serving this function, required full commitment to the craft, and who gave it. This is one of the things the walls say, and it is important to hear it clearly. People were serious about this. Not the right kind of serious. Not serious in the right direction, but genuinely, fully, professionally serious. The labor that went into these walls was not the labor of people who didn't care. It was the labor of people who cared intensely about getting the construction right, who understood that a wall that failed was a wall that had to be rebuilt at great expense, and whose professional identity was bound up with doing the thing properly the first time. The quality of the craftsmanship is evidence of the seriousness with which the institution was conceived. These were not makeshift buildings, they were not temporary measures, they were permanent solutions, built to last centuries, and the builders knew it and built accordingly. The permanence is the second thing the walls say, and it speaks not only about the builder's intentions but about what the institution was understood to be. A temporary holding facility, a place designed to manage a crisis until something better could be arranged, is built in lightweight materials. It is built to be easily modified, easily demolished, easily replaced. A permanent solution is built in stone. The people who decided to build these walls in stone had decided, whether consciously or not, that this was not a temporary arrangement. The people who would live behind these walls were not going to need temporary housing. They were going to need permanent housing. The stone said so. The stone said, "We expect you to be here for the rest of your lives, and we have built accordingly." This expectation, embedded in the very materials of construction, shaped the institution's relationship to recovery in ways that were profound and largely unexamined. An institution built for permanence does not orient itself toward impermanence. It does not design itself around the assumption that its occupants will leave, that they will recover, that the building's function is to serve a transitional moment rather than a final destination. A permanent institution organizes itself around managing long-term residents as efficiently and stably as possible. The thick stone walls, the heavy gates, the long corridors designed for easy surveillance, the institutional rhythm of meals and sleep and work and prayer that filled the days of patients who had no other way to fill them. These were the features of a building that expected its residents to remain, and the expectation was self-fulfilling. An institution built for permanence created the conditions of permanence. The institutional rhythm replaced the ordinary rhythms of life, and over months and years, patients lost the skills and the confidence and the connections that might have allowed them to live differently. The walls that held them also held the institutional life that gradually became the only life they knew. The thick stone did not only prevent escape, it prevented the gradual, ordinary, unremarkable process by which a person relearns that the world outside is navigable. The thicker the walls, the more effective the insulation from the ordinary world, the more complete the institutional replacement of ordinary life, and the more complete the replacement, the less likely that the person inside would ever be able to return to what was on the other side. The walls say this too, if you stand in them long enough. They say, "We were not designed with leaving in mind. Look at the windows. In these ruins they are empty of glass. The glass went long ago, broken by weather or scavengers or the simple weight of time, but the reveals are still there. The deep stone frames that held the windows and shaped what could be seen through them. The reveals are deep because the walls are thick. Where a modern building's window opens flush with the wall, these windows are set back 18 inches, 2 feet, 3 feet in the thicker walls, so that the window is at the end of a stone tunnel, and the view it offers is carefully, architecturally constrained. You do not look out of these windows so much as look through them, through a stone aperture that limits the angle of vision, that shows you a specific selected slice of the exterior world rather than an open prospect, that frames the outside like a painting rather than offering access to it as a lived environment. This is not accidental. The window reveal is a security feature. A window set deep in a thick wall is harder to use as an exit point than a window flush with a thin one. But it is also, whether its designers knew it or not, a philosophical statement about the relationship between the interior and the exterior worlds. The patient looking through these windows was not looking out at the world in the way that you look out of an ordinary window, with the visual information available to you and the possibility of leaning out and calling to someone, or breathing the outside air fully, or feeling the wind on your face. They were looking through a stone frame at a picture of the world, a picture that changed with the season and the weather and the time of day, a picture that was real in every particular but that existed, from the patient's position, as an image rather than an environment. The world outside was visible but not accessible. It could be seen but not entered. It was, from the inside of those thick stone walls, precisely as real and precisely as available as a painting. This is among the most telling things the walls say, because it captures something essential about the asylum's fundamental project. The asylum did not try to eliminate the outside world from the patient's experience. It tried to transform the patient's relationship to that world from participant to observer, from actor to audience, from someone inside a shared human reality to someone watching that reality through a stone frame from a position that is, by architectural design, unreachably outside it. The thick walls and the deep window reveals achieved this transformation more thoroughly and more permanently than any administrative policy could have. They built the exclusion into the stone. They made the patient's relationship to the ordinary world a permanent feature of the building rather than a temporary condition subject to review and revision. This is what we are looking at when we stand in these ruins. We are looking at a decision made in stone about who belongs to the world and who belongs to the institution, a decision that was made once in the 13th century and that was then continuously remade in every subsequent asylum building, every extension, every reinforcement of the perimeter, every deepening of the window reveal, until it had achieved the status not of a decision but of a fact. The thick walls do not say, "We chose to exclude these people." They say, "This is simply where these people are." The naturalization of exclusion is one of the most important things the walls accomplished, and they accomplished it through sheer material persistence, by existing, unchanging, for so long that the arrangement they enforced came to seem as inevitable as geography. Stand in the ruins and look at the sky through the open roof, the sky that the patients could not see, or could see only in that constrained, framed way, through the deep window reveals, is now fully visible, because the roof is gone, because time has undone what human hands built, because the walls that were meant to be permanent have turned out to be less permanent than the suffering they were designed to manage. The sky above these ruins is the same sky as everywhere. It connects these ruined rooms to the city and the fields and the ordinary world that the walls once separated from. The walls are still there, and they still say the things they have always said, and those things are still true about the history they represent. But the sky is also there. The sky the patients could not see, except in that constrained slice through the stone reveal. What the walls say, finally, after everything, after the theology and the humoral theory, the acoustic physics and the arithmetic of escape, the keeper's 30 years and the physician's uncertain observations, the city's convenient avoidance and the builder's genuine craft, the Victorian expansion and the 20th century's partial dismantling, what the walls say in the end is this: we were built to solve a problem that we did not understand, not out of malice, mostly, not out of indifference, entirely, out of the profound human difficulty of encountering suffering that exceeds the available frameworks, suffering that does not fit the existing categories, suffering that makes demands the ordinary world cannot meet, and responding to that difficulty by building something solid around it, by building a container for what could not be contained by softer means, by reaching for stone because stone was the most serious material available, because seriousness seemed to be what the situation demanded, because if you were going to address something this difficult, you were going to address it with materials that would last. The walls lasted. That is undeniable. They outlasted the theories that produced them, the institutions that maintained them, the populations that filled them, the certainties that justified them. They are here now, standing in their ruins, mossy and cold, with rooks in the upper courses and trees in the floors, and they are still, thick, solid, exactly as serious as the people who built them intended them to be. They are saying everything they have always said. The question has always been whether we are willing to hear it, not as a comfortable conclusion about progress, about how far we have come, about the distance between the 13th century and the present. Progress has been made. Some of it is real, significant, the product of genuine learning and genuine courage and genuine revision of inherited cruelty. But the walls lesson is not primarily a lesson about progress. It is a lesson about the relationship between certainty and construction, between the confidence of a given moment's understanding and the permanence of what that confidence builds. Every generation builds in the material of its certainties. The medieval builders built in the stone of humoral theory and Christian theology. The Victorian builders built in the stone of moral treatment and institutional optimism. The 20th century built in the concrete of pharmaceutical hope and community care programs that were better in theory than in practice. We are building now in the materials of our current certainties, some of which are right, some of which are wrong, and we cannot always tell from the inside which is which. The ruined asylum's walls are the remains of someone else's certainty, standing in the landscape as a reminder that certainty does not last, but stone does. That what we build, in the confidence of our understanding, will outlast that understanding, and will speak, from the other side of the distance, about what we believed and what we got wrong, and what we half understood, and what we got right, and what we could not have known, and what we should have known, and what the people inside the walls experienced, that the official history is never quite captured. The walls are still saying it. They will be saying it long after this account is finished, long after anyone reads these words, long after the rooks have moved on, and the trees have finished their slow work of pulling the mortar apart. Stone endures. That was the point. That was always the point. The question the ruins are asking, the question that those thick, serious, permanent, well-crafted, wrong, complex, cruel, partially merciful walls are still standing in the landscape. To ask is whether we are building our own certainties in materials that will speak honestly about us to whoever comes to stand in our ruins, whether the walls we are building now are walls we would want our successors to be able to read clearly, whether what they say, from the distance of whatever future looks back at us, is something we would choose to have said. The walls do not care whether the answer is yes or no. The walls will say what they say regardless. They are stone. They endure. They remember everything. There is a particular quality to the silence that settles over a ruined asylum at the end of the day, when the light has gone amber and low, and the shadows of the remaining walls have stretched themselves across the ground into long dark parallels that make the grass look like pages of a book written in a language no one quite reads anymore. The birds go quiet in stages, the smaller ones first, tucking themselves into the ivy that has colonized the upper courses of the stone, then the rooks, making their final loud objections to the closing of the day before they to fall silent. The wind, if there is wind, moves through the open windows and the empty doorways without resistance now, no longer filtered or blocked or redirected by the institutional life that once filled the space between the walls. It moves freely, the way nothing and no one inside these walls was ever permitted to move freely when the institution was alive and the thick stone was doing what thick stone was built to do. This is the hour when a building like this speaks most clearly, not in metaphor, in the literal language of material and light, and the specific acoustics of enclosed space that has lost its enclosing function. The walls catch the last of the day's warmth, and hold it for a little while after the air around them has cooled, so that if you press your palm flat against the stone you can feel something that is almost like the residual warmth of the people who lived within them, though it is only the physics of thermal mass doing what thermal mass does, having nothing to do with memory or meaning or the persistence of human experience in the places where it occurred. And yet, we have traveled a long way together in these 12 segments. We began in 1247 on a cold London morning, at a gate, with a sound rising from behind it that the city preferred not to hear. We followed the sound through the logic that produced the walls designed to contain it, the theology and the humoral theory, the acoustic engineering and the management calculations, the accumulated tragedies of escapes that ended badly, and the genuine, if partial, insight that removal from chaos could itself be a form of treatment. We sat with the keepers who spent their lives inside those walls, and knew them in ways that no physician or administrator ever did, who learned the building's thermal properties and acoustic peculiarities, and carried in their bodies a knowledge that died with them because no one thought to write it down or considered it worth preserving. We watched the model spread across Europe and the centuries, thickening and expanding and becoming more explicit in its logic of containment, until it produced the vast Victorian asylums that housed thousands of people in buildings, designed to last for levens, indeed well past indeed, well bad by that bout, indeed by that bill with it be beating bit, did been bid. win be bop ip bad dad deep in be with hack bed that with bed with back but the actors but fab with missed but tap I back at the sef the cup up las ba off fact out mud with the what about what this workouts that's a lot of wood it is another woods if wood we stood in the ruins and listened to what the walls still say, and they say a great deal about certainty and its consequences, about the gap between intention and effect, about the particular danger of building permanent solutions to problems you have not fully understood, about the people who lived inside those walls and whose experience was shaped by stone in ways that the stone did not intend and could not have been made to care about, even if it could have been made to understand. What this history asks of us, in the end, is not guilt. Guilt for what people who lived centuries before us believed and built is a cheap and ultimately self-regarding emotion, more about our own comfort with the present than about genuine engagement with the past. What it asks is attention, the same kind of attention that the keeper William gave to his galleries for 30 years, the attention that is specific and sustained and honest about what it sees, the attention that does not look away from the crack in the wall, or the deteriorating mortar, or the window that is not quite secure, the attention that knows the difference between the building functioning as intended and the building functioning as it actually functions, which are sometimes the same thing and often not. We are still building. We have not arrived at the place where the history of how we treat our most vulnerable members has ceased to be a history with further chapters to write. The walls we are building today, in policy, in architecture, in the allocation of resources and the distribution of public attention, will be read by people who come after us with the same mixture of recognition and sorrow that we bring to the ruins of the medieval asylum. Some of what we are building will be recognized from that future vantage as genuine progress, the product of hard-won understanding, real reform, authentic expansion of the circle of consideration and care. And some of it will be recognized as our version of the thick stone wall, well-intentioned, seriously built, deeply shaped by the certainties of our moment, and wrong in ways that we cannot fully see from where we stand. The history in these pages does not tell us which is which. It cannot, but it offers something that is perhaps more valuable than that, the specific, embodied, architectural reminder that the distance between intention and effect is real and persistent and carved in stone, and that the people whose experience was shaped by the walls we build deserve the full weight of our attention before we lay the first course, and during the laying, and after, and always. The walls remember everything. The question is whether we are listening to every person who has lived behind walls not of their choosing, in institutions, in the margins, in the silence that societies build around what they prefer not to see. This history is offered in the recognition that your experience was real, that it mattered, that the stone that shaped it did not define you even when it was designed to, and that the walls, however thick, could never fully contain the humanity of the people inside them. They tried, they failed at that, if at nothing else. The humanity got through. A note to the traveler, and so, good night. Good night to you, traveler, wherever this story has found you in the quiet hour before sleep, in the particular stillness that settles over a room when the day's noise has finally let go its grip and the mind, released from its daytime obligations, begins to move in slower and more searching ways. Good night to you if you came to this history out of pure curiosity, drawn by the strangeness of the past and the specific human puzzle of how people managed what they could not understand. Good night if you came from somewhere closer to the subject. If these walls are not purely historical to you, if somewhere in your own life or the life of someone you love, there is a room that these rooms distantly rhyme with, if the thick stone of the medieval asylum has any echo, however faint and transformed, in your own experience of how the world houses its most difficult human truths, good night to the curious and the haunted, the historians and the healers, the ones who are here professionally and the ones who are here because they could not sleep, and the past seemed like better company than the ceiling. Good night to the ones who found somewhere in these 12 segments and their expanded hours of walking through stone corridors and sitting with keepers and listening to what the walls were made to hold, something that helped them think about where they are and how they got there, and what the walls around them, whatever walls they live within, are saying if they stand still long enough to hear. We have been a long time in these stones together. You and I, we have stood in the cold of medieval winter and pressed our palms to the thermal mass of walls that remember what we cannot quite access. We have listened to the city on one side of the wall and the silence on the other, and tried to hold both without choosing between them. We have sat with the impossible complexity of a history that is neither simply cruel nor simply kind, neither purely ignorant nor purely knowing, neither finished nor quite present, a history that is exactly as unresolved as the human difficulty it was built to address. That difficulty has not been resolved. The walls are still standing, in one form or another, wherever this story's echoes reach. But the night is here, and you have carried these stones far enough for one sitting, and the rooks are settled in the upper courses of the remaining walls, and the last warmth of the day is leaving the stone, and it is time to rest. Sleep well, dream kindly, the walls will still be here in the morning. They always are. Good night, traveler. Safe passage.